Mississippian Kathleen Nelson struggles to make ends meet until she falls for a man whose dream of hitting it big hits an all-time low.
She was immediately attracted to him. She thought he was very handsome.
But when a plan for fast cash results in a savage feud, she's willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to protect her man.
They broke out her window and began beating her.
It was an act of pure evil, and Kathleen was in it for the long haul.
And later, in Alabama, Cara Williams has the world at her feet when she meets a charming Marine.
He was tall, dark, and handsome. And she was the girl next door.
But love takes her on a thrilling ride with only a dead end in sight.
She was comparing them to a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde.
She loved him, and she wanted to please him, even though she knew it was wrong.
For preteen Kathleen Nelson, life on the farm is no picnic in the tiny Mississippi town of Canton.
Her father was a sharecropper, which means they lived on land they didn't own, and they farmed it, and they paid rent.
Kathleen grew up in some very tough conditions. They were actually very poor. They didn't have running water or electricity.
Hard work and love keeps the family afloat until her father dies suddenly before her 16th birthday.
She was very close to her family, specifically her father. The death of Kathleen's father was quite devastating because he was their main source of income.
Now the mom has to try and take over the family business to pay the rent and to get a good crop in. And, if you're not experienced doing that, it's very tough.
With that tremendous loss that Kathleen had and losing that parent, the only thing she thought about is filling that hole in her heart.
Through her grief, she clings to her younger sister, LaVon, who's 2 years her junior. As they move through adolescence and into adulthood, the two become very close.
They went through everything together. They were there for each other through boyfriends, through love, through loss.
Now at 18, the sisters move out on their own in Canton. It's both an exciting time and a challenging time for the young women.
They didn't have a great educational level, so that's going to limit them to manual labor. And to make a good living, there wasn't a lot of opportunities in Canton area for them.
After 15 years of working every dead-end job Canton has to offer, this young woman wants more. She lands a gig at a trucking company 20 miles away in Jackson, Mississippi.
Kathleen got a job driving a truck. Her job was to transport candy.
Love is the last thing on her mind until she meets fellow trucker, 32-year-old Roosevelt Walker, just a few weeks later.
You are really cute in this outfit. I had to come over and let you know.
Excited to meet a female driver in a predominantly male workforce, the charmer quickly makes his move before someone else does.
Roosevelt saw in Kathleen someone that was a hard worker, someone that was very down to earth, and someone that had close ties to family.
They developed this bond that's developed a relationship that eventually led into them becoming boyfriend, girlfriend.
This was her first romantic relationship with a man, which made her quite vulnerable to Roosevelt.
As the two develop their connection, her baby sis is thrilled for her older sister.
LaVon was so fond of Roosevelt that she called him a brother-in-law.
And Roosevelt's 52-year-old roommate, who he calls Uncle Joe, is quickly folded into the mix.
The four of them became like family and had really close relationships. If they weren't at Joe and Roosevelt's, then they were at Kathleen and LaVon's.
There's plenty of love in their lives, but money remains a constant concern for the foursome.
They were all desperately in need of money.
It's a very stressful situation. If it was another way out, it looked like they might take that option.
A way out may have just arrived when the guys think they have figured out a way to make thousands of dollars without having to do much at all.
Joe and Roosevelt were sitting around watching television, and an advertisement came on concerning the black farmer settlement.
The black farmer settlement was a class action lawsuit brought against the United States Department of Agriculture for denying loans to African American farmers on the basis of their race.
When they research the settlement, they find out that the payout for each person's accepted claim is $50,000.
Why not us?
Exactly.
With a criminal record for theft in Uncle Joe's younger years and Roosevelt's spotty employment history, they suspect neither one of them will pass as farmers. But as luck would have it, they know two lovely ladies who might.
Joe and Roosevelt knew that Kathleen and Yvonne came from a farming background, and so they said to them, you two file this claim and see can we get any money.
And when an ally's greed threatens to ruin their plan, Kathleen will stop at nothing to see it through.
So she went over completely to that dark side.
Bitch, I know you don't have a dead body in my car.
So it was all for the love of a man.
Kathleen was not going to let anything come between her and Roosevelt.
Canton, Mississippi native Kathleen Nelson and her boyfriend Roosevelt Walker are tired of working their fingers to the bone with nothing to show for it.
Kathleen and Roosevelt were always working, but it was never really enough to survive on.
Roosevelt and his uncle cook up a way to scam the Black Farmers Settlement Act that was designed to compensate black farmers who've been discriminated against by the government based on race.
Roosevelt and his Uncle Joe suggested to Kathleen and her sister that they submit the claim. If Kathleen and Yvonne's claims were granted, they were looking for about $100,000 to split amongst the four of them.
Kathleen didn't really see this as a crime. She saw this as an opportunity to just kind of take advantage of the system that would benefit not just her, but Roosevelt, and making him happy was also part of the deal for her.
Let's do this.
Okay? It's a lot of money.
Sign the paper.
Now, all in, the sisters come up with an idea to sweeten the pot even more. They can increase their take to $150,000 by adding in a third applicant. When they proposition their childhood friend, 38-year-old Clovis Reed, Clovis wants a piece of the pie, too.
Clovis worked 2 minimum wage jobs, was working all the time, not making a lot of money, and a share of $150,000 would have been very inviting for her.
Eager to get their hands on the money, each of the women fills out the application and sends it in with dollar signs in their eyes. But it isn't to be.
After about 6 weeks, the sisters both received letters in the mail stating that both claims had been denied.
The group assumes Clovis has had the same result, but when they reach out to her, she's no longer accepting their calls.
Clovis, when you get this message, you need to call me. I need to know whether you're getting your check.
Kathleen and Yvonne heard through other friends that Clovis was going to get this $50,000 payout.
And when Kathleen gets the rest of the story going on in the street, her dreams are slashed.
Say what?
Clovis had no intention of ever sharing that money with them.
Kathleen was very upset with Clovis. Not only was this a betrayal to Kathleen, but it was also going to hurt her relationship with Roosevelt.
You're not going to believe this.
Rather than confronting their close friend, the duo comes up with an idea to get their hands on the money after all.
Hello, my name is Clovis Reed. Yes, I'm calling to find out whether my check has been mailed to me.
They decided to call the Black Farmers Fund Administration to see whether the check had been sent. When they called, they learned it had not been.
After consulting with her boyfriend and his uncle, they all decide it's time to cash in. She calls the Settlement Administration one last time with a special request.
Kathleen pretended to be Clovis and told them to reroute the check.
And then requested the check be sent to Levon's P.O. box versus Clovis's actual address. And they succeeded.
Do it? Done. No! It's done.
2 weeks later, the mastermind couldn't be happier when his girl tells him that Clovis's check has arrived.
Now the next step is they have to get it cash. So they need a bank account where they can go deposit the check.
But the women have already got that covered. The devoted girlfriend gets a fake ID, citing she's Clovis Reed.
Levon and Kathleen walked into the bank. Kathleen posed as Clovis, signed all the documents, and they deposited that check.
Now, with $50,000 between the four of them, they think they're living high on the hog.
These are people who have been poor all their life and not have much money, and $50,000 is a lot of money.
Kathleen was overjoyed to see this $50,000. She was getting something that legitimately belonged to her and Roosevelt. And if nothing else, Roosevelt was happy.
As the weeks go by and Clovis doesn't receive her check, she calls the settlement administrators to find out that her check had already been sent out and deposited.
Her hands were tied because if she'd told the authorities, that would have also incriminated Clovis.
Within 60 days of having the cash, the money-hungry foursome spend the entire $50K, finding themselves broke again.
They were right back where they started. They were back working, jobs here and there.
They slog on with their lives as if nothing has happened for the next 2 years. Then, one cold winter day, they open their mailbox and get the jolt of their lives.
Are you kidding me right now?
The two sisters are being indicted and charged with forgery and conversion of Clovis's $50,000 check.
Kathleen and Levon were looking at serious charges, federal crimes, and were facing potential incarceration.
Once they received an indictment, I think it's no doubt that they knew Clovis Reed had to have some role in it.
Roosevelt and Joe did not receive letters of indictment, but they knew that it could only be a matter of time because Clovis knew of their involvement in the scheme.
As their hearing day approaches, Kathleen is in a panic.
She's facing jail time. What's at stake for Kathleen is losing her liberty, her freedom, and her man, Roosevelt.
The siblings turn to the orchestrators for a solution.
What are we going to do? So they call a meeting amongst the four of them. They get together to try and figure out how to deal with Clovis.
I'm running out of patience, and she's got to go.
They talked about it for hours. They went back and forth, and they decided on a plan.
We got to do this now. We got to do it fast.
They felt that they were left with no choice but to kill her.
You trust me, right?
Of course.
Then that's it. She got to go.
Kathleen must have been very, very desperate to plan a murder, especially against a lifelong friend. This speaks to the devotion and the blinding love that she had for Roosevelt.
With their ruthless plan in motion, 5 days before Clovis is scheduled to testify against them, the sisters wait at home as the men take off in Kathleen's car to deal with Clovis once and for all.
Kathleen knew through a friend that Clovis worked at a convenience store near her home, and that she got off about 11 o'clock and would drive home by herself.
The two park in the shadows on a rural road, 2 blocks from Clovis's house in Canton. Within an hour, they spot their target.
Roosevelt blocked Clovis in with Kathleen's car, while Joe threw a brick through Clovis's passenger window.
Kathleen proved without a doubt the most important thing in the world was him.
And later, in Tampa, Florida, Cara Williams will trespass into a world of danger for her new husband.
She knew he was a gambler, but she had no idea he'd be gambling with their lives.
She walked into that bank, slipped that teller that note, and she had to be scared out of her mind.
To date, Congress has provided $1.25 billion to settle the black farmers' discrimination litigation.
The black farmers case was monumental to civil rights because not only was it the largest settlement in history, but it really sought to right the wrongs of past racial injustice.
Kathleen Nelson's boyfriend, Roosevelt Walker, and his uncle, Joe Collins, are out to get revenge on their ex-friend, Clovis Reed, for ratting Kathleen out for her involvement in a fraudulent check scheme.
A week before Clovis was scheduled to testify against Kathleen, she was ambushed on a road in her hometown of Canton, Mississippi.
While Kathleen and her sister wait anxiously at home, Roosevelt and his uncle are executing a plan to make Clovis disappear.
They were able to make her pull over. When she stopped the car, they broke out the window.
As their rival comes face to face with her attackers, she screams for dear life. But it's too late.
After taking Clovis from her car, Roosevelt and his Uncle Joe beat her to death.
They quickly put her lifeless body in the trunk of their car and make sure no one's seen them before driving off into the night.
Roosevelt and Joe called Kathleen, and Roosevelt asked Kathleen to come remove Clovis Reed's car.
What do you mean she's not breathing? Bitch, I know you don't have a dead body in my car.
Listen, just come get the car, okay?
Kathleen appeared to be quite shocked they actually killed Clovis. This was a friend of theirs that they had known for much of their lifetime, that she would end up in this sort of situation. But she was not going to turn Roosevelt in. She was going to stand by her man.
She could have stopped this thing in its tracks, but she made the conscious decision to gratify herself by not losing Roosevelt.
Her sister overhears the conversation, and despite their horror, they jump into action, doing as they're told.
We gotta go now. What? We gotta move the car. Let's go. Let's go.
Levon's role was to take Kathleen to Clovis's car and follow Kathleen to a location where they could actually ditch Clovis's car in Jackson. They were trying to make it seem as though there was a robbery.
Hurry up!
As the siblings abandon the car and wipe it down for prints, Roosevelt and Joe dispose of the last piece of evidence, the body.
They drove 50, 60 miles away to a rural area in Simpson County, Mississippi.
While Roosevelt holds Clovis's lifeless head in place, his uncle uses a Kaiser knife to savagely decapitate her, before cutting off her hands so no one can identify the body.
They took the head in the hands and put it in a bag, got in Kathleen's car and drove off.
They dispose of the appendages in a place where nobody ever finds them. Now that her troubles have been buried, Kathleen breathes a sigh of relief.
Kathleen definitely crossed over to the dark side in this case. It was all, for the love of a man that she would do this.
2 days later, in the field where they left the body, a beekeeper stumbles upon the discovery of a lifetime. Despite not having a head or hands, investigators are able to identify Clovis's body through DNA.
This was big news. It was a federal witness that people who she was going to testify against didn't want her to testify.
By the next day, FBI agents have a warrant for both sisters' cell phone records, where they discover the name Roosevelt Walker for the first time. Then the agents hit the jackpot when they discover that on the night Clovis went missing, Roosevelt's phone pinged off a cellular tower close to where the body was found. That same day, their victim's abandoned car is located.
There was also phone records indicating that LeVon had been near that apartment complex where Clovis Reed's vehicle was found.
Joe's name doesn't come up since he doesn't have a cell phone. That night, investigators find the ladies at their house, along with Roosevelt. Under the hot lights, the three maintain they were at their respective homes when Clovis met her demise.
They're not aware that the investigators have the cell phone records and the records from the tower.
When investigators reveal the incriminating evidence against them, Kathleen and her man stand strong. But baby sis crumbles.
She admitted to conspiring to murdering Clovis Reed.
LeVon took a plea deal which involved her testifying against Joe, her sister Kathleen, and her boyfriend Roosevelt. She ended up getting 25 years.
Faced with a possible life sentence, she is steadfast on standing her ground with her boyfriend.
Even though she could have struck a deal, her devotion to Roosevelt wouldn't allow her to do it, so she was going all the way in protecting him.
The ill-fated lovers are tried together and are convicted of conspiracy to commit murder. They're each sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole, and neither turns on the other.
Kathleen stood by her man. She never changed her tune. She supported Roosevelt throughout the trial.
10 months later, Joe Collins is convicted of the first-degree murder of Clovis Reed. He never tells anyone what he did with Clovis's head and hands. Kathleen has the rest of her life behind bars to ponder how she let love lead to her demise.
Kathleen's downfall was falling in love with Roosevelt at that particular point in her life. She'd not had any significant relationships. He came along during a time that she was vulnerable.
You go from being this hard-working person, never been in serious trouble, to being involved in a murder. That's a pretty good jump.
It ended with the death of a lifelong friend, the loss of her freedom, and the loss of a relationship, the closeness, the intimacy with Roosevelt.
Kathleen Nelson put all her bets on the wrong guy, and the losses were catastrophic. 300 miles away in Gadsden, Alabama, Cara Williams also gets caught between love and unstoppable forces of greed. Growing up, Cara's life seems to be ripped out of the pages of a fairy tale in Gadsden, Alabama.
Cara was definitely the all-American girl. Cute little blonde, blue eyes. She had two younger siblings who looked up to her. She was close with her mom and dad. They adored her.
I always said about Cara that there was never a stage big enough or a microphone loud enough for her, because she loved to perform and she loved to be the center of attention.
Throughout school, she spends most of her time in front of a crowd.
Cara was very involved in a lot of sports. She played softball, she did cheerleading.
After high school, she becomes the first person in her family to go to college.
Cara was very excited. Her family was excited, and she had a goal to be successful.
4 years and a psychology degree later, the 21-year-old marries her college sweetheart.
Everything started out fine. The marriage was great, but then quickly things took a turn.
He started to become very controlling, very abusive, and she started to fall into a deep depression at that time.
We definitely saw a personality change in her. Someone that had been, very bubbly and outgoing, almost was like she went into a shell.
After 3 years of sinking deeper into depression, she files for a divorce. Though many women would falter in the face of a failed marriage, Cara thrives. She gets a job as a sales rep for a national paper shredding company.
She made this 6-figure salary, and she was ranked as the #1 sales rep in her region.
She really found and reconnected with her own self-worth. That was her sense of identity.
She had gone from a very low point to a very high point very fast.
But in less than a year, another shot at love will put her autonomy to the test. And she'll take the gamble of a lifetime.
We need to hit another bank right now.
The stakes were very high for Cara, and so she felt that she had no choice.
Whatever she had to do to save her marriage, she was going to.
Gadsden, Alabama, 26-year-old Cara Williams has the world at her fingertips after ending her 3-year marriage.
After the divorce was finalized, that's when she was able to reinvent herself. She came out of depression. She got a 6-figure paying job. Things were really looking good.
After 6 months of working long hours, she decides it's time to live it up with her friends on a girls' trip to Sin City.
Cara was excited. She hadn't been anywhere for a while, and this was her time to finally let loose.
But on her first night out on the town, she gets more than she bargains for when 26-year-old stunner Emmanuel Williams notices her from across the bar.
Here's this 6-foot-tall black man, very handsome, attractive, and charming. Just knocks her off her feet.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
She wasn't looking for love. She was there to just have a good time with some friends.
The two talk for hours, spilling out their life stories to each other.
She knew that he was a Marine. She knew that he was from California, and he told her that he was a professional gambler. The way he presented himself, Cara thought he made good money doing that. They were together nonstop from that point. By the time they left Vegas, Cara was in love.
Over the next 2 months, the lovebirds jet back and forth between Alabama and California and talk on the phone, keeping their romance alive and growing.
He seemed like he was a good guy. He seemed like he was crazy about her.
She was very happy with him. She felt fulfilled. She felt that she found somebody who needed her.
Distance is the only thing that stands in their way. But when her company offers her an opportunity to relocate to Tampa, Florida, she sees this as their chance to make a fresh start together.
Cara knew he was the one. She wanted to start a family with him.
I think they felt like that was a neutral place to go.
Her new boyfriend couldn't be happier with the move. But being a professional gambler in Tampa isn't quite as lucrative as the Vegas Strip.
Cara tried everything she could do to make sure that their life together was wonderful in Tampa. They had a beautiful condo, and they were living the good life.
And when the once successful salesgirl finds herself falling behind in the highly competitive Tampa sales office, the good life turns sour.
This region was different. The managerial style was very different. The quotas were different. She found herself not excelling like she was before.
A few months after moving in together, she's forced to resign from her job after being unable to kick up her sales.
The bills were stacking up for Cara and for Emmanuel. He's not bringing home any money. There's a lot of pressure to make ends meet.
Right away, she lands a job as a part-time customer service rep at a bank. But it's a big pay cut, and Emmanuel is spending more time at the casino.
When she first met him, she knew that he was a professional gambler, but she didn't know that this was an addiction, something that had totally consumed him and controlled him.
Just when their financial stress starts weighing down their relationship, a surprise brings them closer together. The couple finds out they're pregnant.
Cara was excited about being pregnant. She thought, this is going to be that piece that fixes everything.
They decided to get married. They went down to the courthouse to make it official, and that was supposed to be the beginning of what was supposed to be a great life together.
But when the newlyweds arrive home from the courthouse, reality hits them harder than ever.
It was a really exciting time because they were expecting their first baby together. But at the same time, it was a really dark time for them because they weren't sure how they were going to afford this baby.
For Emmanuel, that was the green light to step it up with the gambling.
Despite her concern for their child's welfare, she keeps their troubles to herself.
Cara wanted to contact her parents for money. Emmanuel was against that. He felt that it was an insult to his manhood.
They would be willing to help us.
No, Cara.
She never mentioned that there was ever any money issues. She wasn't letting on that there was trouble between her and Emmanuel. We had zero clue of the gambling. Zero.
Nearly 9 months into the pregnancy, his gambling gets them further into debt.
She tried to get him to move away from that lifestyle, to focus on family, wanting him at home, spending time with her, preparing for the new baby, and was just unable to do so.
Emmanuel knew that time was running out. They had to make a change in their financial situation. Cara was about to go on maternity leave, and there'd be no money coming in.
Let me get this for you.
Then, 1 week before the baby is due, he finds himself captivated by a true crime documentary.
Hey, look, I was wondering, I had this idea, right?
This show is about a man who got away with robbing some banks. And so that sparked some interest with Emmanuel because of their financial situation.
Never one to shy away from risk, he approaches his wife that evening when she returns home from work.
So Emmanuel suggested to Cara, why don't we go and rob some banks?
Are you kidding?
Look, it'll just be one time.
After she realized it wasn't a joke, she was blown away. She never committed any crimes in the past. She didn't even have any tickets.
Cara was 9 months pregnant, and we're talking about hormones flowing. She just wants to have her partner around and have her family unit remain whole.
She had to make a decision. Either I align with what he's going to do in hopes that I can save him and save my family, or I don't.
We won't get caught?
No. She loved him, and she wanted to please him, even though she knew it was wrong.
Sure,
Cara quickly realized that Emmanuel was going to do this with or without her, and perhaps her getting involved in this bank robbery was a way to let him know that he was not alone in doing this.
Just 2 days later, early in the morning, Cara drives her husband to a bank just 2 miles from where they live. He instructs her to wait in the car as the getaway driver, ready to step on the gas when he returns.
Emmanuel got out. He has on this disguise, a wig, the glasses.
Emmanuel just walked into the bank like any other customer and approached the teller like there was nothing going on.
He slides the teller the note. It says, "Give me all your money, and I have a gun."
Outside, Cara can't wait for this terrifying moment to end.
She doesn't know if the police is going to intercept them. She doesn't know if they're going to get arrested on the spot. On top of that, she's 9 months pregnant, so she could actually go into labor at any time, and the stress could have possibly brought on the delivery at a time like that.
But she's about to discover that once a gambler, always a gambler.
This is not enough. Run on the street, we're going to the next bank, I see.
And this time, Tampa, Florida, expectant mother Cara Williams is persuaded by her husband Emmanuel that the answer to their money problems is to rob a bank.
Cara loved Emmanuel very, very much, and she wanted to do anything and everything she could in her power to save him, to save their marriage. And she thought, if we just get through this one thing, everything will be fine.
This is a woman who's 9 months pregnant, about to give birth at any minute now. And instead of being at home, having her feet up, planning the birth of her first child, she's in a getaway car.
As Cara nervously waits in the car with her foot hovering over the gas pedal, Emmanuel is face to face with a bank teller, where he intends to walk away with thousands in cash.
Emmanuel just very slowly and discreetly handed the teller the note. Now, he didn't have a gun with him, but that note said he had a gun, and they took him seriously.
Teller couldn't find an envelope, so she handed him cash. and he took that, put it in his pocket, and fled the bank.
Go, 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 go,
A
go.
rush of adrenaline surges through the couple as they make the 10-minute drive home with $7,500 and no one on their tail. Once reality sets in, her adrenaline turns to remorse, but Emmanuel has an all too familiar glow.
Cara had seen that sparkle in his eye, or that thrill in his face, and she'd seen it before when he was gambling.
Cara slowly started to realize it wasn't just about the money. This could be going in a really bad direction.
You could hear a pin drop as they hide the 7 G's in a drawer. Emmanuel is already thinking about the next time, and Cara is praying it won't come.
Going into the bank, now was substituting the payout from the casino. He's enjoying that high of winning.
In the meantime, local investigators already have a lead on their thief.
Police were called immediately, and they've had access to the surveillance tape, which clearly showed Emmanuel going into this bank with his wig and these glasses. So now the hunt is on, looking for the perpetrators of this bank robbery.
The cameras don't capture the getaway car, and since Emmanuel has no criminal record, none of the mugshots from their list of usual suspects are matching his description. 10 days later, all of the couple's problems momentarily disappear when Cara gives birth to a healthy baby girl.
Their financial worries were better. They were able to buy everything they needed for the baby, and she felt like this was the true beginning of the family that she always wanted.
Until 3 weeks into her unpaid maternity leave, their financial problems return.
The money's gone. They've absorbed it with the bills, Emmanuel's gambling habit. So Cara decided to go back to work to bring in some more income and get a steady flow of some money coming back in.
But that's not enough for the high roller, whose thirst for action is catching up to him.
Cara wasn't making a lot. She was only working part-time. Emmanuel made the decision to rob yet another bank. He didn't talk about it with Cara, didn't discuss it. He made the decision, told her what to do, and she did it.
4 weeks after their first heist, the new parents drop their daughter off at daycare and drive 12 miles outside of Tampa to a town called Brandon.
The second time, it's a repeat. Cara drove the getaway car. Emmanuel got out, wore the costume. He went in, slipped the teller a note once again.
But in this instance, the teller told him that she could only get $1,000 at a time. So instead of a big payout, he only walked away with $2,000.
He is furious, but he quickly flees with the measly take.
First robbery, they made out with $7,500. This time, only $2,000. So what do gamblers do? They see if they can top the last win.
We gotta hit another bank right now.
What, are you kidding me?
No, this is not enough. This is not worth the risk.
He brazenly tells Cara to drive 3 miles down the road to a different bank, where he's determined to hit it big.
And at that next bank, that wasn't the big payoff that he wanted either. He only got about $1,100. Emmanuel was mad. He was angry. He wanted more.
And he's determined to get more. Over the next 8 months, they pull off 10 more robberies, netting a total of $33,000 in additional cash.
She was afraid that if she didn't do this, he'd become so dysfunctional that he couldn't be a father and that the family unit could not function in any way.
The two might be flying under the radar for the moment, but authorities are hot on their heels connecting the bank robberies and in hot pursuit, trying to identify them.
Emmanuel knew that things were getting too hot in Florida, and it was time to leave.
The next time, after dropping their daughter off at a friend's house, they drive 5 hours toward the state line with the plan to stop at the first town they hit in Alabama. Once they arrive in Dothan, Emmanuel gives Cara the shock of her life.
Listen to me very carefully, okay? I know you're scared. You can do this.
Okay, I can do this.
You can do this.
He felt it was her turn now. Emmanuel wanted Cara to go into the bank and rob it.
He did not want to be, he only wanted to take accountability.
After putting on glasses and a wig from their stash, Cara gets out of the car.
When Cara went into the bank, she was terrified. Her heart was beating fast. She didn't think she could go through with it.
And all the money in the world can't prepare her for what she's about to face.
It was her way of proving to Emmanuel that she loved him. but everything spiraled out of control.
That was probably the absolute worst day of my life when I got the phone call.
Did for her husband.
She had been in 4 separate banks and would keep coming back to the car and telling him she couldn't do it. And he was on her really, really hard, putting a lot of pressure on her to go in and rob a bank.
Tampa, Florida couple Cara and Emmanuel Williams have been robbing banks for nearly a year. Up until now, Cara's waited in the getaway car while Emmanuel held the place up. But this time, her man wants her to take the lead.
You can do this.
Okay, I can do this.
You can do this.
He wanted Cara's hands dirty by going in and robbing a bank.
She knew she could lose her life, she could lose her liberty, she could lose her child. But in her eyes, she had so much more to gain, and that was the love and admiration of Emmanuel.
As she nervously walks into the bank, hidden under a disguise, she knows there's no turning back.
She gave the note to the teller that says, "This is a robbery. I have a gun. Hundreds, 50s, and 20s.
They handed her $3,000, and she walked out of that bank just like Emmanuel had done before.
Pinching themselves, it seems once again they've made it out without being caught by the police. And Emmanuel couldn't be more proud of his girl.
She wanted to prove to him how much she loved him. This time she succeeded.
But her gambler isn't finished playing their high-stakes game. Dead set on making the trip worthwhile, and after a quick call to their child sitter, he decides to take a detour 180 miles east to Gulf Shores, Alabama, where they spend a couple of days choosing their next target.
Emmanuel wasn't satisfied with the bank robbery that Cara had just done. So Emmanuel went into another bank in Alabama and got close to $7,500.
As they pull off their 15th bank robbery without a hitch, the duo immediately hit the road home, back to Tampa with a total of 10 grand in their bag. They are completely unaware that their luck has just run out in Florida. The FBI and local authorities are working around the clock to identify them.
In almost all of the robberies, a witness had seen a black car being used as the getaway vehicle.
But they still need a license plate number and a name. Then, on a hunch, law enforcement gather the surveillance footage from a toll road near their most recent Florida robbery. After scanning hundreds of cars going in and out of the area, immediately following their escape, investigators land their first big break in the case.
They were able to determine that this particular black car had went through the toll, and at that point, they thought they found their car.
And the plate number that went with it. DMV records indicate the black vehicle is registered to a Cara Williams.
They determined that her husband was Emmanuel Williams. And from there, they saw that he matched the description given by the various witnesses at the banks.
A call to their mobile carrier was the final nail in the coffin.
Their cell phone records placed them near the vicinity of these crimes, and now they have enough evidence to make an arrest.
Just as the couple pull into their driveway, after the long road trip back from Alabama, the authorities swoop in. They are arrested in front of their home, putting their 11-month escapade to an end.
When I got the phone call from Cara, Cara was hysterical. She said, "I've done something terrible." She robbed a bank. It's insanity. And my heart is broken, and my daughter's going to jail.
Faced with federal robbery charges, they both plead guilty. Because neither one of them had a criminal record, Cara is sentenced to 5 years in a federal prison, and Emmanuel is sentenced to 5 years and 10 months in prison.
It was a perfect storm here, falling in love with Emmanuel, his gambling addiction, and now his bank robbing addiction. So this was so overwhelming to her. I believe that she just surrendered to the circumstances.
Over halfway through her 5-year sentence, she can't wait for the day that she's back in her daughter's life.
Losing out on just even the first 5 years of her child's life.
The blistering heat of Phoenix, Arizona in November of 1999 did not just melt the asphalt. It baked an unyielding, suffocating terror directly into the foundation of a quiet, residential enclave known as Paradise Valley. On a Tuesday morning that began with the mundane hum of lawnmowers and distant highway traffic, 26-year-old bank teller and quiet community volunteer Angela Sterling vanished into the thin, dry desert air, leaving behind an empty apartment, a boiling teapot on a live burner, and a front door unlocked to the world. Within minutes of her sister's arrival to investigate the sudden silence, local authorities were confronted with a scene that defied every convention of an ordinary abduction or missing persons file. There were no bloodstains on the beige carpet, no signs of a desperate struggle against a violent intruder, no forced entry on the aluminum door frames, and absolutely zero biological trace materials for the early forensics teams to secure. It was a cold case from its inception, a terrifyingly clean evaporation of a human being that sent a massive shock dong through a neighborhood where residents previously slept with their windows wide open to the cool desert nights. The only anomaly in the entire living space, sitting squarely on the polished glass kitchen table like a mocking punctuation mark, was a single, half-empty ceramic coffee cup that did not belong to Angela, still emanating a faint, bitter aroma of dark roast into the empty room. The initial investigation launched by the Phoenix Police Department was a frantic, high-stakes dragnet that quickly devolved into a nightmare of administrative tack and vanished leads. Search teams deployed across the jagged terrain of the surrounding McDowell Mountains, helicopters swept over the sun-bleached ravines with thermal imaging arrays, and detectives logged hundreds of exhausting hours interviewing friends, co-workers, and strangers who had walked the same streets that November morning. Every pathway led directly into a brick wall. Angela had no known enemies, no hidden debts, no volatile past relationships, and her banking records showed a financial history that was utterly routine and stable. The lead homicide investigator, a seasoned veteran named Marcus Vance, faced the cameras nightly under the glare of news vans, offering a grim, determined facade while privately admitting to his team that they were tracking an absolute ghost, a predator who had slipped into a locked apartment, executed a flawless extraction, and vanished back into the urban sprawl without leaving a single footstep in the dust. Weeks melted into months, the sensationalist headlines faded from the local newspapers, and Angela's file was systematically cataloged, stamped, and buried in the basement archives, a legendary piece of unfinished business that would haunt the department for nearly 3 decades. The passage of time did nothing to dull the sharp, agonizing void left in the heart of the Paradise Valley community, where Angela's disappearance became a permanent, generational ghost story told to warning newcomers about the fragile illusion of safety. For 27 years, her family lived in the suffocating limbo of the unknown, staring at unchanged portraits, marking birthdays that were only celebrated in the quiet of their minds, and wondering if the person who broke their world was still walking among them. Detective Marcus Vance retired with honors, his name celebrated in the precinct as a relentless hunter who had simply been outmatched by a perfect, phantom-like crime that left no exit for justice to pursue. The ancient, analog evidence bins containing Angela's personal items sat undisturbed in climate-controlled storage, gathering dust while the world outside transitioned into an era of deep digital tracking, global database networks, and advanced biometric identification. The case was dead, frozen in the amber of November 1999, until a routine administrative audit of the department's unsolved homicides in the spring of 2026 brought a fresh, unblinking set of eyes to the yellowed pages of the original manifest. A junior technician assigned to the newly formed automated fingerprint identification system update took an interest in the file, realizing that the solitary piece of physical evidence recovered from the kitchen table, the ceramic coffee cup, had only been subjected to the primitive, manual fingerprint comparison methods available at the turn of the millennium. In 1999, the smudged partial print lifted from the handle of the cup had been run against a highly restricted, localized registry of known offenders, yielding a definitive negative result that led investigators to dismiss the item as an irrelevant remnant of a social visit. But the landscape of 2026 was entirely different. The modern system was an integrated, lightning-fast web that connected state registries, federal databases, military records, and international maritime licensing networks with a subatomic scanning precision that could read through decades of physical degradation. The technician loaded the high-resolution scan of the partial lift into the system, clicked a button, and watched as the algorithm began its DONDAP, rapid-fire comparison against millions of biometric profiles across the continent, searching for the precise intersection of friction ridges that had been left behind in Angela's kitchen 27 years prior. The moment of the match was not accompanied by a siren or a flashing light. It arrived with the cold, absolute silence of a monitor updating to display a single, verified name that sent an immediate shockwave through the upper echelons of the Phoenix justice system. The partial print from the handle belonged to a 61-year-old retired landscape contractor named Arthur Pendleton, a man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a neighboring county for nearly 3 decades without ever triggering a single red flag on the local police radar. The realization that a fingerprint on a coffee cup would lead to handcuffs after 27 years completely shattered the cold case team's paralysis, shifting the dynamic from a passive historical inquiry into a high-intensity, tactical operation that had to be executed with absolute secrecy. Detectives worked in DONDAP, exhausting shifts to construct a comprehensive shadow profile of Pendleton's life in 1999, pulling old employment contracts, forgotten residential leases, and archived vehicle registrations to map his movements against the exact coordinates of Angela Sterling's final morning. What emerged from the digital extraction was a terrifying picture of a highly organized, completely invisible stalker who had used his professional access to the manicured lawns of Paradise Valley to map the vulnerabilities of his target over a period of months. In the winter of 1999, Pendleton's landscaping company had held a maintenance contract for the exact apartment complex where Angela lived, giving him an all-access pass to move through the property during the day without drawing a single suspicious glance from neighbors or security staff. He had watched her routine, noted the precise minute she left for work, and discovered the vulnerability of her rear kitchen door, slipping into her living space under the cover of a routine maintenance schedule while carrying his own coffee container to project an air of complete, mundane normalcy. The single print he left behind on the cup wasn't a mistake of panic. It was a microlapse in an otherwise perfect execution, a solitary fragment of his physical identity that he had forgotten to wipe clean as he exited the structure with his victim, leaving it to wait in the dark for 27 years until science finally developed the capacity to turn it into an arrest warrant. As tactical units finalized the operational planning to intercept Pendleton at his current residence, the internal atmosphere at the Phoenix precinct was a mixture of electric urgency and deep, historical gravity. The detectives knew that executing a warrant on a cold case of this magnitude required a total absence of procedural errors. They were going to confront a man who believed he had outrun the law, a man who had watched the turn of a century, built a quiet retirement, and lived with the absolute certainty that his secret was buried deeper than the desert clay. The deployment was fast, dawned-up, and silent. A fleet of unmarked units converging on a suburban street just as the first morning sun began to pierce the horizon, their movements synchronized with the precision of a modern military strike. When the breach team crossed the threshold and the handcuffs clicked around Arthur Pendleton's wrists, the expression on his face was not one of rage or frantic denial, but a sudden, terrifying hollow look of absolute, paralyzed realization, the sudden, crushing understanding that the past had finally caught him by the hand, and that the single print left on a ceramic handle in 1999 had just sealed his destiny forever. The booking of Arthur Pendleton inside the Maricopa County Jail was conducted under an administrative shroud of total security, as investigators immediately turned their focus toward the secondary, more agonizing phase of the operation, locating the final resting place of Angela Sterling. The fingerprint had provided the physical connection to the scene, but to secure a definitive conviction for capital murder, the prosecution required the material proof of her remains, a task that required them to dismantle the 30-year history of Pendleton's regional construction projects. A specialized task force of forensic geologists, canine units, and spatial mapping analysts was deployed to 3 distinct desert properties that Pendleton's firm had developed or cleared during the late 90s, turning thousands of acres of sun-bleached dirt into an active, high-tech search grid. The dawned-up progression of the excavation teams moving through the remote canyons outside Phoenix was broadcast via local news updates, resurrecting the old headlines of 1999 and forcing the city to relive the trauma of Angela's disappearance with an unprecedented, visceral intensity. Inside the interrogation room, Pendleton sat in absolute, unyielding silence, his eyes fixed on the concrete table as veteran detectives tried to exploit his psychological collapse to extract a location for the burial site. He did not ask for a lawyer initially. He merely maintained a cold, clinical detachment that mirrored the behavior of the most sophisticated institutional predators, a calculation that proved he viewed the legal process not as an arena of moral accounting, but as a technical battle of endurance. He understood, better than anyone in the room, that while the fingerprint locked him into the apartment, the desert was a vast, unforgiving vault that did not give up its secrets easily, and that without a body, the state's case would have to rely heavily on circumstantial timelines and historical inference. The psychological chess match ground on for days, the air inside the small room thick with a suffocating, static tension as investigators used every analytical tool in their possession to find the crack in his armor, while outside, the heavy machinery continued to tear into the dry earth of the Arizona wilderness. The turning point in the forensic search arrived on the fourth day of the excavation, when ground-penetrating radar units operating in a remote section of the Sonoran Desert Reserve identified a structural anomaly 4 feet beneath the surface of an old retaining wall Pendleton's crew had poured in December of 1999. The signature matched the density profile of an intentional, hand-dug trench that had been backfilled with high-density gravel and capped with a thick layer of industrial concrete to prevent erosion or animal disturbance. When the recovery teams carefully breached the stone barrier under the blinding glare of stadium lights, the atmosphere shifted instantly from an investigation into a solemn, historic cathedral of recovery. Preserved by the extreme, arid conditions of the desert soil and the protective concrete seal, the forensic anthropologists unearthed the remains of Angela Sterling, along with personal effects that matched the exact descriptions recorded in the original 1999 missing persons file. The discovery was a massive shock to Songdong that brought a definitive, crushing end to the family's 27 years of agonizing doubt, providing the unshakable material witness that would transform a cold case arrest into an absolute legal execution of a killer's legacy. The preparation for the trial became a national fixation, with legal scholars and forensic experts converting downtown Phoenix into a high-profile media arena as the state attorney's office finalized an indictment that left no exit for the defense. The prosecution designed an evidentiary presentation that was dawned-up, rapid, and visually overwhelming, planning to lead the jury through a seamless progression from the subatomic scanning of the fingerprint to the physical recovery of the remains in the desert, leaving absolutely no space for the defense to manufacture alternative theories or exploit procedural loopholes. On the opening day of the trial in July of 2026, the temperature in the courtroom was icy and static, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat outside, as Angela's surviving sister sat in the front row of the gallery, her eyes locked onto the profile of Arthur Pendleton as he was led into the room in heavy chains. The long, agonizing night that had begun with a boiling teapot and an unlocked door in November of 1999 was finally meeting its absolute, unappealable dawn, and the city waited with a fierce, unified patience for the definitive delivery of a justice that had taken half a lifetime to arrive, but which was now close enough to touch. The prosecution's opening statement inside the packed courtroom was a masterclass in forensic reconstruction, a narrative that moved with the cold, unyielding momentum of a mathematical proof. The district attorney held up a duplicate of the simple white ceramic coffee cup that had sat on Angela's kitchen table for 27 years, letting the silence of the room magnify the object's mundane, terrifying weight before she uttered a single word. This cup was not an invitation. Her voice resonated through the high-ceilinged room with a clear, metallic force. It was a signature. It was left by a man who believed that his authority over his targets was absolute, a man who believed that the desert heat would melt away his tracks and that the primitive limitations of 1999 technology would grant him a lifetime of immunity. He did not know that every time he pressed his hand against this handle, he was writing his own arrest warrant, a biological confession that would survive the turn of a century, survive his retirement, and find him in the dark of his own home. As the DA spoke, the digital displays behind her flared to life, projecting three-dimensional, high-resolution scans of the fingerprint ridge matching process. The presentation was quick, dawned-up, and highly visual, demonstrating to the jury how the modern automated fingerprint identification system had identified 24 distinct points of minutiae along the partial lift, far exceeding the legal standard required to establish an absolute, unassailable match for Arthur Pendleton. The defense team sat rigid, their faces pale under the glow of the projection screens, their initial objections regarding the chain of custody for the 1999 evidence lockers overruled by a judge who had already verified the flawless, unbroken records maintained by the precinct's archival staff. The jury watched with an intensity that bordered on the reverent, their eyes moving from the glowing ridge lines on the monitors to the frozen, expressionless profile of the old man who sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together as the architecture of his 30-year lie began to systematically crumble into dust. The trial progressed into its second week with an onslaught of technical data that stripped the defense of any remaining room to construct an alibi. The prosecution called the state's chief forensic geologist, who used soil density mapping and mineral analysis to link the aggregate concrete found at the desert burial site directly to the specific inventory records of Pendleton's landscaping firm from December of 1999. The science was absolute. The mineral fingerprint of the sand used in the mix matched a proprietary blend that Pendleton had purchased in bulk just 3 days after Angela's disappearance, proving a level of immediate, calculated premeditation that left the courtroom in a state of suffocating, paralyzed silence. The defense's cross-examination of the geologist was a hollow, desperate exercise in semantics, focusing on minor weather variations in the Sonoran Desert over the past 3 decades, arguments that collapsed instantly when the technician demonstrated that the concrete seal had remained entirely impervious to environmental degradation since the hour it was poured. The emotional climax of the proceedings arrived when the state introduced the personal journals and surveillance notes recovered from a safe inside Pendleton's home during the 2026 raid. Even after 27 years of living a quiet, suburban existence, he had preserved a detailed, handwritten log of Angela Sterling's daily movements during the autumn of 1999, written in a precise, clinical hand that revealed the deep, sociopathic organization of his pathology. The reading of these entries, detailing the exact minutes she returned from the bank, the colors of her clothing, and his cold, analytical evaluations of her home security, caused a visible wave of horror to ripple through the jury box. The jury was no longer looking at a fragile, elderly contractor. They were looking at an apex predator who had used the landscape of the city as a private hunting ground, hiding his violence behind the very green spaces meant to bring peace to the community. The defense team, recognizing that their narrative of sample contamination and historical unreliability had been utterly demolished by the state's forensic architecture, attempted a final, desperate pivot to a defense centered on their client's advanced age and failing health, appealing to the jury for a measure of leniency based on the idea that the old man in front of them was no longer the threat he had been in 1999. But the prosecution met this maneuver with a swift, clinical finality during their closing statement, pointing directly to the family of Angela Sterling who sat in the front row, their lives permanently truncated by the cold-blooded calculation of the defendant. Justice does not have an expiration date. The DA's voice cut through the heavy air of the room like a thunderclap. The passage of 27 years does not diminish the terror of that November morning, nor does it dilute the absolute necessity of accountability. The defendant enjoyed 3 decades of freedom, 3 decades of sunsets, and 3 decades of life that he violently stole from Angela Sterling. His age is not a shield. It is a reminder of how long he has run from the blood on his hands. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 4 hours, a speed that reflected the absolute, unyielding mass of the forensic evidence presented by the state. When the forepersons stood to read the verdict, the quiet inside the courtroom was so profound that the rhythmic ticking of the court reporter's machine sounded like a countdown toward an explosion.
Guilty.
guilty on all counts of capital murder, kidnapping, and burglary. As the word was pronounced, Arthur Pendleton did not flinch. He did not look at his attorneys, and his expression did not alter by a fraction of a degree, maintaining the same cold, sociopathic detachment that had allowed him to live a double life for half a lifetime. The gallery, however, released a collective, low surge of raw emotion, a deep, systemic release of air that had been held by an entire community since November of 1999, as the finality of the verdict brought an absolute measure of closure to a wound that had remained open for a generation. The sentencing phase concluded with Judge Sterling delivering a blistering, resolute address that served as a permanent coda for the city of Phoenix. She sentenced Arthur Pendleton to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, ordering him to be removed immediately to a maximum security facility where the remaining years of his life would be spent within the sterile, concrete reality of a 5-by-8-foot cell, a fitting, permanent containment for a predator who had sought to bury his actions in the vastness of the desert wilderness. As the bailiffs led him away in heavy irons, the sound of his chains clicking against the linoleum floor was the final, metallic note of a 27-year odyssey that had transformed the landscape of modern forensics, proving with absolute certainty that no distance of time and no depth of earth can ever truly hide the record of violence when science and persistence refuse to let the memory of the lost sleep. The fallout from the conviction of Arthur Pendleton did not end with his removal to the state penitentiary. It triggered an immediate, sweeping audit of every single commercial and residential landscape project his firm had managed across the Southwest between 1985 and 2010. Cold case units from multiple states began cross-referencing his corporate travel logs and equipment rental receipts against the unresolved missing persons files of young women from the same era, realizing that a predator who operated with such chilling, forensic precision had likely left a trail of hidden atrocities that extended far beyond the boundaries of Maricopa County. The city of Phoenix, wrapped in the quiet heat of a late summer evening, looked toward the McDowell Mountains with a new, sober clarity. The old fear was gone, replaced by a deep, enduring respect for the relentless march of modern science that had pulled the truth out of a smudged partial print on a forgotten cup. Angela Sterling's family returned to the Paradise Valley enclave not to mourn, but to dedicate a small, light-filled memorial garden near the site of her former apartment, a space defined not by the shadow of her disappearance, but by the permanent restoration of her name and her humanity. The long, agonizing night that had begun with a boiling teapot in November of 1999 had finally met its absolute, unappealable dawn, leaving behind a legacy of vigilance, transparency, and an unshakable proof that justice will find a way through the concrete, through the clay, and through the decades to hold the monster to account. The file was officially locked, the evidence tags validated, and the truth stood absolute, a permanent shield against the recurrence of a tragedy that took half a lifetime to solve, but which proved, once and for all, that the record of blood will always speak when the future develops the ears to listen. The institutional shudder that accompanied the formal booking of Arthur Pendleton didn't just rattle the glass partitions of the Maricopa County Jail. It completely liquefied the foundational assumptions of a city that had spent 27 years looking for a ghost. Inside the Phoenix Police Department's cold case homicide unit, the atmosphere turned toxic within a matter of minutes as internal affairs agents and state investigators systematically cordoned off the archived evidence bins containing the original materials from the November 1999 investigation. The realization that the primary suspect was not some transitory drifter or out-of-state predator, but a deeply embedded, quiet member of the local commercial infrastructure created a logistical and psychological crisis that sent shockwaves through the entire municipal legal system. Every commercial property Pendleton's landscaping firm had graded, every retaining wall his crews had poured, and every residential contract he had maintained across the Valley of the Sun was suddenly pulled into a vortex of profound suspicion, turning the architectural history of Phoenix into a potential crime scene that had to be forensically dissected under the unblinking, hostile glare of regional media. Outside the precinct walls, the news of the fingerprint match hit the Paradise Valley enclave like a flash flood of raw, existential horror. For 27 years, the community had lived under the heavy, suffocating illusion that Angela Sterling's disappearance was the result of a random, lightning-fast abduction executed by an outsider who had long since left the state. To discover that the monster had been a routine fixture on their manicured lawns, a man who had moved through the gated complexes with an all-access pass under the cover of a routine maintenance schedule was a betrayal that defied the boundaries of conventional language. Her old apartment complex, which had undergone multiple corporate renovations since 1999, was instantly surrounded by satellite trucks and crowds of stunned citizens, all struggling to comprehend how a calculated killer could have sat in Angela's kitchen, drank from her ceramic cups, and then spent the next 3 decades collecting municipal contracts and living a quiet, suburban life while his victim remained completely dissolved into the desert ether. The state attorney's office immediately recognized that prosecuting a case born from a single partial print lifted 27 years ago required a total departure from standard legal procedure. They had to build a case that was not merely persuasive, but mathematically and scientifically indisputable, knowing that Pendleton's defense team would aggressively exploit the nearly 3-decade gap in the chain of custody. A specialized, insulated prosecution task force was established in a high-security downtown annex, working around the clock to reconstruct Pendleton's life during the autumn of 1999 with a level of micro-detail that resembled a forensic autopsy of time itself. They began by pulling his original commercial tax filings, his company's employee timesheets, and his heavy machinery rental receipts from November of 1999, comparing them against the unedited property logs and the newly recovered digital metadata from the precinct's ancient analog storage lockers. What they unearthed was a pattern of micro-movements so precise, so subtle, that it proved Pendleton had targeted Angela with a chilling, predatory focus that spanned months before the final extraction occurred. On the morning of November 16, 1999, the exact date Angela vanished, Pendleton's corporate vehicle logs showed an unexplainable 4-hour gap in service that had been manually entered into his company's ledgers as a mechanical delay. The task force discovered that during those 4 hours, while the teapot in Angela's kitchen was boiling down to dry steel on a live burner, Pendleton had not been waiting for a tow truck. He had been manufacturing his alibi. The spatial analytics specialists demonstrated that he had intentionally parked his commercial white utility van in the complex's deep blind spot, directly beneath the dense foliage of a row of mature ironwood trees that his own crew had planted 3 months prior. This positioning ensured that his vehicle was completely shielded from the view of the main leasing office and the passing traffic on the nearby arterial roads. The level of premeditation was dawned at, relentless sequence of calculated decisions that proved Pendleton viewed the layout of the complex not as a green space to be maintained, but as an intricate, physical trap engineered for his own survival. As the financial and land use registries from Pendleton's 30-year career were laid bare under federal subpoenas, a secondary, hidden history began to materialize from the margins of his old landscaping files. Investigators uncovered a series of bulk concrete purchases and unmapped equipment transport receipts tied to 3 distinct desert properties that his firm had cleared for development during the late 90s. Search warrants for these remote desert sectors were executed at midnight by a heavily armed multi-jurisdictional task force, their powerful spotlights cutting through the giant saguaros and the sun-bleached brush as heavy excavation equipment rumbled into the remote canyons. What they found beneath the concrete retaining walls and the deep gravel foundations of those properties turned a single homicide prosecution into a sprawling, multi-state serial predator inquiry. Neatly organized inside an airtight, heavy-duty utility box hidden within the false bottom of Pendleton's old commercial storage unit were the driver's licenses, student IDs, and personal effects of 3 other young women who had vanished from various southwestern communities between 1992 and 2004, women whose disappearances had never been solved. The discovery of the hidden utility container sent an immediate, paralyzing shock dong through law enforcement agencies from Tucson to Las Vegas. The narrative of the quiet, retired contractor was permanently dead, replaced by the terrifying reality of an institutional apex predator who had used his landscaping business as a passport to explore the vulnerable peripheries of expanding suburban developments. Every time a new residential community pushed its boundaries into the raw desert clay, Pendleton had been there, offering his grading services, subtly mapping out the unmonitored sectors, and then returning under the cover of darkness to bury the evidence of his violence beneath the very concrete infrastructure he was contracted to build. The diary of his operations, reconstructed by tracing his old commercial chemical purchase orders and industrial tool rentals, showed an eerie, rhythmic correlation between his heavy machinery projects and the sudden, unexplained evaporation of young women whose physical profiles matched Angela Sterling's with terrifying precision. Inside the Maricopa County Jail, where Pendleton was held under a special administrative segregation protocol to prevent his suicide or injury from the general population, the veteran contractor adjusted to his new identity as a capital defendant with a chilling, unyielding stoicism. He refused to speak to the state investigators, ignored the psychological evaluation teams, and spent his recreation hours walking the precise perimeter of his concrete courtyard with a steady, measured pace that resembled his old site surveying cadence. When his defense team, hired through a network of private assets and liquidation funds from his former business, attempted to mount a strategy centered on the potential degradation of the 1999 fingerprint sample, Pendleton reportedly remained completely silent, staring through them with a cold, flat indifference that unnerved his own lawyers. He knew, better than anyone alive, that the next-generation biometric scanning was an absolute mathematical trap. He had spent his life using the permanence of structural concrete to hide his secrets, and he understood that his own touch had left an unshakable, permanent witness on that ceramic handle that no legal rhetoric could dissolve. The preparation for the trial became a national fixation, with legal analysts and true crime documentarians converting downtown Phoenix into a sprawling media arena. The courtroom of Judge Evelyn Sterling was fitted with high-definition digital displays and secure audio-visual arrays to handle the massive volume of technical evidence, creating an environment that felt less like a traditional criminal trial and more like a high-tech forensic symposium. The prosecution knew that their primary obstacle was not the defense team, but the psychological resistance of the jury. They had to convince 12 ordinary citizens that a man who had spent his entire life being seen as a mundane, hard-working contractor was capable of a hidden, industrial-scale depravity that spanned decades. To achieve this, they designed a donned-up, fast-paced evidentiary presentation that would hit the jury with a continuous, unyielding wall of facts, transitioning seamlessly from the biometric data to the material infrastructure records, leaving absolutely no space for the defense to manufacture alternative theories or exploit nostalgic public sentiment for the old man. On the opening day of the trial in July of 2026, the temperature in Phoenix soared past 115 degrees, but inside the packed courtroom, the air was icy, static, and heavy with a suffocating collective gravity. Angela Sterling's surviving sister, now a frail woman supported by her family, sat in the front row of the gallery, her eyes locked onto the profile of Arthur Pendleton as he was led into the room in heavy leg irons and a sterile jumpsuit. The contrast between the two figures was devastating. The aging survivor who had spent 27 years carrying the open wound of her sister's disappearance, and the pristine, unblinking predator who had spent those same decades collecting property values, building a quiet retirement, and living in comfort on the foundation of her ruin. As the clerk called the court to order, the low hum of the gallery died instantly, replaced by a silence so deep, so absolute, that the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's machine sounded like a countdown toward an impending explosion. The prosecution began their opening statement not with a description of the night of November 16, 1999, but with an image of the cup itself. The district attorney held up a high-definition digital photograph of the white ceramic coffee cup, its handle highlighted in a stark blue overlay that isolated the microscopic friction ridges left behind by the killer's hand. The screen flared with the image, its mundane, household nature reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the ceiling, and allowed the room to sit with the weight of the evidence for 10 long seconds before she spoke. This cup is not just a piece of kitchenware. Her voice resonated through the high-ceilinged room with a clear, metallic force. It is an unshakable biometric signature. It is the physical proof that Arthur Pendleton did not just maintain the lawns of Paradise Valley. He breached the sanctuary of Angela Sterling's home. He used his professional access to track her, to isolate her, and to steal her life, leaving behind a solitary fragment of his own identity on this handle, a fragment that has waited in the dark for 27 years to pull him into this courtroom. As the district attorney spoke, the digital displays behind her flared to life, displaying a massive, synchronized timeline that mapped Pendleton's commercial equipment rentals against the physical structure of Angela's apartment complex on the morning of the abduction. The presentation was rapid, dawned-up, and visually overwhelming, linking the old analog work orders with modern digital geographic mapping to prove that Pendleton had systematically cleared his schedule for 3 hours surrounding the exact minute Angela's phone records went silent. The defense team sat rigid, their objections overruled by a judge who had already reviewed the scientific validity of the state's biometric matching process and refused to allow the proceedings to be delayed by procedural skirmishes. The jury watched with an intensity that bordered on the reverent, their eyes darting from the flashing data points on the screens to the frozen, expressionless face of the defendant, who sat with his head tilted slightly upward, his jaw set in a hard, defensive line that had been honed by decades of living behind a mask of total normalcy. The true climax of the trial's first week arrived when the state called the forensic biometric technician who had performed the next-generation automated scan on the preserved 1999 lift. The witness, an expert in ultra-deep ridge pattern analysis, used a three-dimensional digital model to explain how the modern algorithm had identified 24 distinct points of minutiae along the smudged partial print, far exceeding the legal standard required to establish an absolute identity match. The technician demonstrated that the friction ridges captured on the cup's handle were completely unique to Arthur Pendleton's right index finger, providing a physical link to the immediate interior of the crime scene that no circumstantial argument could blur. The science was so precise, so unassailable, that it stripped the defense of their remaining narrative of sample contamination, proving with the absolute certainty of mathematics that the quiet landscape contractor had been standing at Angela's kitchen table during the critical window before the alarm was raised. The weight of this scientific proof seemed to physically alter the atmosphere inside the courtroom, shifting the dynamic from an investigation of potential guilt to a public, legal execution of a 27-year lie. The defense's cross-examination of the biometric technician was a hollow, desperate exercise in semantics, focusing on minor temperature variations in the evidence storage lockers over the past 3 decades, arguments that collapsed instantly when the witness demonstrated that the original chemical developer used to preserve the print had locked the ridge characteristics into a stable, permanent matrix that was entirely impervious to environmental degradation. The jury's faces hardened into masks of uniform condemnation, their posture leaning away from the defense table as the realization settled into the room that there was no exit left for the old contractor, that the very future he had tried to outrun had finally caught him by the fingers, and that his legacy was being systematically reduced to a historical stain on the record of the city he had claimed to build. As the court adjourned for the weekend, the media trucks outside scrambled to broadcast the details of the biometric testimony to a global audience hungry for every detail of the Paradise Valley phantom. The story had evolved from a local cold case into a historical turning point for Southwestern jurisprudence, a definitive demonstration that time can never truly erode the physical record of violence when the tools of the future are applied to the tragedies of the past. The city of Phoenix, wrapped in the heavy, scorching heat of a desert summer night, seemed to hold its collective breath as the trial marched relentlessly toward its next phase, its residents finally realizing that the long, agonizing night that had begun with an unlocked door and a boiling teapot in 1999 was entering its terminal hours, and that the dawn would bring a reckoning that no concrete, no distance of time, and no lifetime of deception could ever hope to stop. The second week of the trial inside the Maricopa County Courthouse opened with an icy, clinical stillness that stood in brutal contrast to the relentless Phoenix sun baking the concrete plazas outside. The state's prosecution team, having anchored their opening salvos in the subatomic certainty of the next-generation fingerprint analysis, now shifted their focus toward the industrial and corporate architecture that Arthur Pendleton had utilized to conceal his crimes. The district attorney launched a DONDAP, rapid succession of sub-investigations into the historical record, calling a sequence of retired municipal engineers, former commercial concrete suppliers, and archived records clerks to the witness stand. The narrative was no longer just about a tragic disappearance. It was the meticulous exposure of a systemic structural manipulation, revealing how a seemingly ordinary landscape contractor had co-opted the very growth of the Phoenix suburban sprawl to build a multi-decade fortress of anonymity over the body of Angela Sterling. The prosecution's primary objective for this phase was the absolute, unyielding deconstruction of the corporate paper trail Pendleton had generated during the winter of 1999. The state introduced giant, digital scans of the original hand-signed work orders, equipment manifestos, and chemical inventory sheets from Pendleton's defunct landscaping firm. Projected onto the massive courtroom monitors, these yellow documents were stripped of their historical obscurity, analyzed with advanced imaging software that exposed microscopic inconsistencies in the ink signatures and manual erasure marks along the chronological ledger. A forensic document examiner from the Arizona Department of Public Safety took the stand, pointing directly to a critical work order dated November 16, 1999, the exact morning Angela evaporated from her Paradise Valley apartment. The examiner demonstrated that the entry for Pendleton's primary commercial utility van had been manually altered with a non-standard industrial ink solvent, obscuring an original 4-hour dispatch notation and replacing it with a fraudulent entry claiming the vehicle was confined to a municipal maintenance yard for a routine axle repair. As the document examiner laid bare these physical alterations, the jury watched with an intensity that bordered on the visceral. The defense table remained a zone of rigid, sweating paralysis. Pendleton sat with his weathered hands flat against the polished oak surface, his face an unmoving mask of cracked leather, but his eyes tracked the moving laser pointer across the altered signatures with a sharp, calculating focus that betrayed his internal panic. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life relying on the slow, bureaucratic decay of paper records to protect his secret, believing that the turn of a century would permanently dissolve the physical evidence of his movements into the historical ether. To see those very documents pulled out of the dark, digitized with submicron clarity, and analyzed with the cold, mathematical precision of modern forensic technology was a psychological execution that he was entirely powerless to resist. The administrative deconstruction accelerated into a terrifying spatial narrative when the prosecution called the retired fleet manager who had supervised the commercial vehicle pool for the Paradise Valley residential developments in 1999. The state introduced the original, handwritten gate logs and security ledger books from the apartment complex where Angela had lived. The witness, an elderly man whose voice trembled under the immense weight of the memory, walked the jury through the chaotic timeline of the initial search. He testified that on the afternoon of November 16th, while Angela's sister was frantically calling the police from the open front door of the apartment, Pendleton's commercial white utility van had bypassed the standard exit protocol, utilizing a secure, rear service gate that was reserved exclusively for heavy machinery transport and grading equipment. He told me he had a broken hydraulic line on his commercial mower, the witness stated, his eyes locking onto Pendleton with a piercing, unforgiving glare. He told me he needed to clear the vehicle out of the residential sector before it leaked oil onto the pristine turf. I opened the gate for him without checking the interior manifest. I thought he was just protecting the landscape. I didn't know he was driving a tomb. The digital mapping specialists returned to the witness stand to synchronize this gate log with Pendleton's verified industrial fuel purchases from that exact week. The result was an undeniable, dawned-up trail of physical movement that left no room for alternative interpretation. On the night of November 16, 1999, while the first search helicopters were sweeping their thermal spotlights across the immediate perimeter of Paradise Valley, Pendleton's corporate credit card had been processed at an automated commercial fueling depot in a remote, unmonitored sector of the northern Sonoran Desert Reserve, more than 40 miles away from his authorized maintenance route. The prosecution was effectively showing the jury that Pendleton had used the entire layout of his commercial enterprise as a tactical asset, exploiting his professional knowledge of the city's expanding periphery to transport his victim under the cover of a routine infrastructure project. The introduction of the secondary discoveries recovered from the false bottom of Pendleton's commercial storage unit was the moment the trial transitioned from a localized homicide prosecution into a sweeping, historical reckoning on institutional vulnerability. The district attorney did not display the contents of the hidden utility box all at once. She introduced them with a slow, agonizing precision that emphasized the calculated nature of the defendant's pathology. The first item pulled from the digital evidence folder was a laminated student identification card belonging to Melissa Croft, a 21-year-old university student who had vanished from a Tucson apartment complex in the spring of 1992, a property where Pendleton's firm had held the primary excavation contract during the installation of a master drainage network. The screen flared with Melissa's portrait, her bright, youthful face a devastating contrast to the rusted, industrial-grade steel container where her identity had been suppressed for 34 years. The prosecution called Melissa's surviving father to the witness stand, a man whose fragile appearance hid a hard, diamond-like resolve that held the courtroom in a state of absolute, breathless silence. He testified about the agonizing decades spent searching for a sign and how a quiet, polite landscape contractor named Arthur Pendleton had actually assisted the family during a community-organized search event in 1992, even providing his own commercial trenching equipment to clear a line of debris near the desert highway. "He stood right next to me," the father whispered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the resurrected trauma. "He handed me a bottle of water. He told me that as a father himself, he couldn't rest until we brought my girl home. And all the while, he had her license locked in his storage unit. He had her life buried under his own concrete." The explosion of raw, suffocating emotion in the gallery was so intense that Judge Sterling was forced to call a temporary recess, leaving the jury to sit in the heavy, silent dark with the image of Melissa's card burning into their minds like an unquenchable accusation. When the court reconvened, the defense team launched a frantic, high-stakes legal maneuver to have the entire contents of the hidden utility box excluded from the trial, arguing that the items were tied to uncharged, unproven offenses that had no direct logical bearing on the specific murder of Angela Sterling. They claimed that introducing these trophies was a deliberate attempt by the state to inflame the passions of the jury, manufacturing a prejudicial narrative of serial predation that would compromise the defendant's constitutional right to a fair trial on the singular count of the indictment. The argument was delivered with a sweating, frantic intensity by Pendleton's lead counsel, who understood that if the utility container remained in evidence, the structural defenses of his client were entirely shattered. The district attorney's response was a swift, clinical exercise in judicial precedent that cut through the defense's rhetoric like a scalpel. She argued that the items were entirely admissible under the common scheme or plan doctrine, demonstrating that Pendleton's method of utilizing his landscaping access to target victims, preserving their identifications in identical industrial containers, and sealing his crimes beneath commercial infrastructure was a consistent, signature behavioral profile that proved identity, intent, and the total absence of mistake. "We are not showing the jury these trophies to prove the defendant is a bad man," the DA argued, her voice ringing with a hard, metallic force. "We are showing them his signature. We are showing them the industrial methodology of a predator who used his business as an all-access pass to the lives of his targets." The utility box is the connective tissue that links the kitchen table of Paradise Valley to the desert retaining walls of the Northern Reserve. It is the proof that Angela Sterling was not a random tragedy. She was a specific, calculated entry in a lifelong ledger of violence. Judge Sterling ruled in favor of the state, her decision delivered with a cold, uncompromising brevity that signaled the absolute collapse of the defense's legal strategy. The remaining items from the container were formally read into the record. The driver's license of a young woman who vanished from Flagstaff in 1996, a silver charm bracelet belonging to a girl who disappeared near Henderson, Nevada in 2001, and a tarnished locket containing the photograph of a victim from a 2004 cold file that had never even been linked to a known suspect. Each revelation was a hammer blow that systematically transformed Arthur Pendleton from a quiet, retired suburban contractor into one of the most sophisticated, invisible institutional predators in the modern history of the Southwest. The psychological decomposition of the defense team became apparent during their cross-examination of the state's forensic accountants and material analysts. They had no ground left to stand on, no alternative theories to offer, and no scientific data that could challenge the deep biometric scan that had locked Pendleton to the handle of Angela's coffee cup. They resorted to aggressive, semantic squabbling, attempting to question the chain of custody for the utility box during the 12 hours it was transported from the commercial storage yard to the Central State Laboratory in Phoenix. They cross-examined the tactical team leaders on the exact barometric pressure inside the transport vehicle, suggesting that the extreme desert heat could have caused a condensation warp that corrupted the biological material inside the plastic sleeves, an argument that was dismissed with near-derisive ease by the state's forensic chemists, who demonstrated that the items had been preserved in near-perfect, airtight isolation since the moment Pendleton had buried them. Inside his cell during the weekend recesses, Pendleton's behavior began to shift from stoic indifference to a restless, kinetic internal panic. The guards assigned to his high-security watch reported that he no longer spent his hours pacing with his old, measured site-surveying cadence. Instead, he would sit at his small concrete desk, his fingers moving across the surface in a frantic, phantom mimicry of sketching blueprints, as if he were remapping his old commercial excavation sites, trying to find the one procedural error, the one unmapped drainage line, the one hidden variable that could dismantle the state's spatial case. He was a man who had been undone by the very thing he trusted to protect him, the permanence of his own physical constructions. He had kept his trophies because his sociopathic arrogance convinced him that his corporate facade made him immortal. He had preserved the evidence of his own ruin because he truly believed that the future would never possess the digital eyes to see through the concrete foundation. The public reaction in Phoenix during the second week of the trial had evolved from shock into a sustained, system-wide demand for total structural accountability. The local news media was no longer just reporting on the daily courtroom testimony. They were conducting deep, investigative audits of the entire city's historical zoning records, commercial construction permits, and infrastructure contracts from the 1990s and early 2000s. Editorials demanded the immediate creation of an independent, civilian-led commission with the power to subpoena every single public works project Arthur Pendleton's firm had ever touched, raising the terrifying possibility that dozens of other cases dismissed as desert runaways, missing tourists, or unresolved accidents were actually the work of the landscaping phantom. The trust that had been built over decades between the citizens and the expanding suburban infrastructure was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, watchful suspicion that viewed every new housing development, every retaining wall, and every manicured green space through the dark, unforgiving prism of Pendleton's 27-year deception. On the final day of the week, the prosecution called their final witness for the administrative phase of the case, the retired municipal zoning director who had overseen the development permits for the Paradise Valley and Northern Reserve sectors during the late 90s. The witness, a man whose face was etched with the profound, exhausting shame of an institutional oversight failure, admitted under oath that there had been minor red flags regarding Pendleton's unmapped grading activities and off-hours heavy machinery operation as early as 1999, but that they had been systematically dismissed because his firm consistently completed projects ahead of schedule and under budget. "We didn't look closer because the concrete was poured and the lawns were green," the witness stated, his voice cracking under the weight of the confession. He was the contractor who made the desert look beautiful. We didn't stop to think that he was using the beauty to hide the bodies. The admission was the final, devastating nail in the coffin of the old contractor's legacy. It was a declaration of systemic blindness that left the courtroom in a state of stunned, paralyzed silence. The prosecution had achieved its immediate goal. They had not only proven that Arthur Pendleton was the individual who breached Angela Sterling's home, but they had exposed the blind spots of an entire city's expansion that had allowed a wolf to grade the very earth beneath their feet with absolute impunity for half a lifetime. As the judge adjourned the court for the weekend, the image that remained on the giant digital displays was not the fingerprint models, but the collective, unyielding faces of the victims whose lives had been reclaimed from the silence of his ledger, a silent, permanent jury that was waiting, with an absolute and terrifying patience, for the final, inevitable arrival of an unappealable justice. The third week of the trial inside the Maricopa County Courthouse faded into the fourth, bringing a profound transformation in the presentation of the state's case against Arthur Pendleton. The prosecution had successfully anchored the physical connection to the crime scene through the next-generation fingerprint match on the ceramic coffee cup and dissected the deceptive corporate paper trail that protected his movements. Now, the district attorney moved to dismantle the physical, geographic, and geological walls that Pendleton had built around his primary crime scene. The state launched a DONDAP, rapid-fire sequence of scientific testimonies, calling advanced forensic geologists, satellite imaging analysts, and heavy machinery mechanics to the witness stand. The objective was absolute: to prove to the jury that Pendleton had intentionally used the rapid expansion of the northern Phoenix suburban infrastructure as a structural weapon to entomb the physical remains of Angela Sterling beneath 4 feet of industrial-grade aggregate concrete. The week opened with the testimony of a senior spatial analyst from the Arizona Department of Transportation who utilized historical satellite and aerial surveillance photography from November and December of 1999. The analyst projected a series of layered, three-dimensional digital maps onto the massive courtroom screens, transforming the raw, sun-bleached desert canyons of the northern Sonoran Reserve into a precise, computerized grid. The presentation was quick, DONDAP, and highly visual, showing the jury how the terrain had shifted day by day during the weeks following Angela's disappearance. The analyst pointed directly to a specific coordinate along an unmapped retaining wall that Pendleton's landscaping company had been contracted to erect for a private residential development project. When we analyzed the multispectral imaging from late November 1999, the analyst testified, his voice maintaining a flat, scientific precision, we detect an unrecorded, highly localized excavation anomaly that occurred entirely outside the authorized blueprint schedule for the retaining wall foundation. The prosecution synchronized this multispectral satellite data with the maintenance and operational logs of Pendleton's heavy machinery fleet. A red indicator line representing his company's primary commercial trenching excavator flared to life on the monitors, tracing a sequence of midnight movements that sent a visible shudder through the gallery. The data proved that on the night of November 18, 1999, exactly 48 hours after Angela vanished from her Paradise Valley home, the excavator's engine had been activated for 3 consecutive hours in the dead of night, operating without any authorized work order or municipal clearance. The defense team launched a frantic wave of objections, claiming that the historical satellite imaging lacked the resolution to verify the specific machine identity, but Judge Sterling denied the motion with an icy brevity. The science was backed by the manufacturer's internal electronic hour meters recovered from the machine's ancient onboard computer, proving an absolute, calculated pattern of clandestine night operations that no legal rhetoric could blur. The narrative then descended into the deepest, most harrowing phase of the forensic recovery process as the state called Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief forensic anthropologist who had directed the secret midnight excavation of the Northern Reserve property in April of 2026. The courtroom lights were dimmed to full darkness, and the giant monitors illuminated the room with high-resolution, raw photographs from the recovery site. The images were stark and clinical, captured under the harsh, white glare of forensic stadium lighting, documenting the meticulous deconstruction of the concrete retaining wall foundation. Dr. Thorne walked the jury through each layer of the earth, describing how his team had to utilize diamond-tipped concrete saws and sonic ground-penetrating radar to peel back the aggregate barrier without disturbing the fragile materials preserved beneath the stone matrix. The structural design of this burial site represents a high level of forensic sophistication, Dr. Thorne stated, his voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. The perpetrator did not simply dig a hole in the desert dirt. He explicitly engineered an anaerobic vault. He poured a 2-inch base of high-density gravel to accelerate the drainage of fluids, wrapped the remains in heavy-duty industrial chemical-resistant sheeting, and then capped the entire trench with a 4-inch layer of fiber-reinforced structural concrete before backfilling the area with native desert clay. This calculated preparation had backfired against the killer over the decades. The concrete cap and the extreme, arid conditions of the Sonoran clay had combined to form a near-perfect mummification environment, preserving the clothing, personal effects, and structural integrity of Angela Sterling's remains in an unbroken state since the hour she was hidden. When the screens shifted to display the actual preservation state of the remains within the trench, a collective, broken sob echoed from the front row of the gallery, where Angela's surviving sister sat supported by her family. The monitors showed a small, tarnished silver charm bracelet still resting against the radius bone of the victim's left wrist, the exact bracelet described in the original 1999 missing persons report, featuring a distinct, hand-engraved desert rose charm that Angela had received for her 25th birthday. Dr. Thorne pointed to the image with a gloved finger, letting the clinical weight of the photograph hang over the jury box for 10 long seconds before moving into the trauma analysis of the skeletal structure, delivering a dondap sequence of anatomical facts that left no doubt regarding the violent nature of her death. The post-mortem examination revealed distinct, paramotum compression fractures along the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone, confirming an absolute diagnosis of manual strangulation executed with immense physical force. Dr. Thorne demonstrated through a three-dimensional biomechanical model that the force required to fracture the hyoid structure in a 26-year-old female was consistent with a sudden, dominant assault delivered from a position of absolute physical control. The jury sat in a state of uniform, frozen hostility, their eyes darting between the horrific fractures on the monitors and the unmoving, leather-like face of Arthur Pendleton, who sat with his chin tilted slightly upward, his jaw set in a hard, defensive line that refused to grant the court a single human expression of remorse or fear. The defense team's cross-examination of Dr. Thorne was a desperate, sweating exercise in semantic distraction. They attempted to argue that because the remains had been encased in aggregate concrete for 27 years, it was impossible to isolate the exact chemical markers of strangulation from the natural mineral leaching of the cement mix, suggesting that the fractures could have occurred post-mortem due to the immense shifting weight of the retaining wall structure over decades. But Dr. Thorne blew the alternative theory apart with a single, devastating reference to the microscopic histology reports. He proved that the marrow space within the fractured bone edges contained distinct, localized petechial hemorrhaging, a physiological reaction that can only occur while the heart is actively pumping blood, locking the trauma to the final minutes of Angela's life, long before her body ever came into contact with a concrete mix. The prosecution reinforced this physical trauma data by calling a chemical analyst from the state forensics laboratory who had analyzed the specific composition of the concrete cap used to seal the trench. The analyst demonstrated that the aggregate mix contained a rare, highly specific volcanic ash additive that had been utilized by only one commercial concrete supplier in Maricopa County during the final 2 months of 1999. Under a federal subpoena, the prosecution introduced the commercial delivery ledgers and billing statements from that supplier, proving that Arthur Pendleton's landscaping company had taken delivery of 3 bolt cubic yards of that exact volcanic ash aggregate mix on the morning of November 17, 1999, less than 24 hours after Angela vanished. The billing statement bore Pendleton's own bold, ink signature, providing an unshakable material link between his commercial inventory and the physical tomb in the desert. The donned-up presentation of geological mapping, satellite anomalies, skeletal trauma, and commercial delivery ledgers left the defense table completely marooned. They had no counter-experts who could challenge the chemical signature of the concrete, no data to dispute the machine hour meters, and no narrative framework that could explain how their clients' commercial resources had been used to construct a secret grave in the northern canyons. They sat in low, whispered huddles, their posture sagging as the trial marched relentlessly toward its conclusion, their strategy reduced to an existential wait for the prosecution to exhaust its list of physical exhibits. Pendleton himself seemed to be withdrawing deeper into his own internal, sociopathic isolation, his eyes tracking the movements of the prosecutors with a cold, analytical intensity that indicated he was no longer looking for an exit, but was instead evaluating the precision of the trap that his own touch had sprung on him. Outside the courthouse walls, the city of Phoenix was living through a period of collective, system-wide fury that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of the Sterling family. The revelation that a prominent commercial contractor had used the very infrastructure of the city's expansion to bury his victims had shattered the public's perception of safety, generating a shocked Songdong that dominated every local media platform. The Sterling Memorial Foundation organized nightly vigils outside the municipal planning departments, their thousands of candles forming a dense, quiet ring of fire that illuminated the downtown plazas, a silent, powerful demand that the city must implement independent forensic audits of all historical infrastructure projects from the late 90s to ensure that no other dark secrets remained buried beneath the concrete growth of the valley. As the fourth week drew to its close, the prosecution pulled the disparate elements of the geological and physical evidence together into a singular, devastating climax. They recalled the lead cold case investigator to the stand, who placed the physical charms, the mummified fabric samples, and the volcanic ash concrete core samples onto the evidence table in front of the jury box. The object sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, a small, quiet, and terrifying monument of absolute condemnation that left no room for doubt and no space for alternative interpretation. The prosecution's case was resting its scientific phase, having constructed an unassailable fortress of facts that left the defense completely exposed, leaving the city and the families to wait with a fierce, absolute patience for the final, thunderous arrival of an unappealable justice in the coming days. The fifth week of the trial inside the Maricopa County Courthouse marked a definitive transition from the physical geology of the desert tomb to a clinical, terrifying exploration of the psychological blueprints that guided Arthur Pendleton's dual existence. The state's prosecution team, having anchored their case in the absolute certainty of the next-generation fingerprint match and the chemical composition of the concrete cap, moved to expose the deep, sociopathic organization behind the defendant's 30-year mask of total suburban normalcy. The district attorney launched a DONDAP, rapid progression of behavioral evidence, calling a succession of forensic psychologists, digital data retrieval experts, and behavioral analysts from the Federal Bureau of Investigation to the witness stand. The objective was clear and unyielding: to demonstrate to the jury that the quiet, retired contractor sitting at the defense table had systematically weaponized his professional routine, transforming his daily landscaping surveys into a sophisticated surveillance apparatus that allowed him to stalk his targets with absolute impunity. The week began with the formal introduction of the evidence seized from the hidden safe within Pendleton's suburban estate during the high-stakes tactical raid of 2026. The courtroom lights were adjusted, and the giant central projection screens flared to life with high-resolution digital scans of the handwritten surveillance logs Pendleton had maintained since the late 1980s. The presentation was quick, DONDAP, and intensely visual, forcing the jury to read the precise, blocky handwriting of a killer who kept an itemized ledger of his predatory instincts. Each volume was organized by region and year, containing detailed, multi-layered profiles of young women who lived in the upscale residential complexes of Paradise Valley, Scottsdale, and Tempe. The analyst from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit took the stand, pointing directly to the sections dedicated to the autumn of 1999. The logs revealed that Pendleton had tracked Angela Sterling's movements for more than 12 weeks before executing the final extraction on November 16th. The surveillance logs were written with the cold, detached formatting of a commercial contractor surveying a job site, stripped of any emotional language or erratic impulses. Pendleton had recorded the exact minutes Angela's bedroom lights were activated in the morning, the license plate numbers of the vehicles that parked in her driveway, the route she walked to the local commercial banking district, and even the specific days she received deliveries. The FBI analyst demonstrated to the jury that Pendleton had systematically cross-referenced this personal tracking data with his company's landscape maintenance schedules. What we are evaluating is an industrial-scale system of predation, the analyst testified, his voice maintaining a flat, professional resonance that cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. The defendant used his corporate contracts as a cover to conduct static surveillance. He wasn't a random prowler hiding in the bushes. He was the professional contractor standing openly on the lawn with a clipboard, mapping the vulnerabilities of his target while the community watched and smiled. The prosecution synchronized the dates on these surveillance logs with the historical maintenance invoices Pendleton's firm had submitted to the leasing office of Angela's complex in 1999. The correlation was absolute and damning. Every single entry in his personal notebook corresponded to a day when his crew was scheduled to perform aeration, sod installation, or irrigation repairs within the immediate visual perimeter of Angela's rear kitchen door. The data proved a level of continuous, calculated stalking that completely shattered the defense's remaining narrative that Pendleton's fingerprint on the coffee cup was the result of a casual, coincidental social interaction. The jury watched the flashing data streams with an intensity that bordered on the visceral, their eyes moving from the clinical precision of the timelines to the frozen, leather-like profile of the defendant, who sat with his arms locked tightly across his chest, his gaze fixed on the monitors with an unblinking, sociopathic detachment. The psychological deconstruction descended into an even darker phase when the state introduced Pendleton's personal journals from the weeks immediately following the murder. These entries were not confessions of guilt or expressions of panic. They were cold, analytical evaluations of the local police performance and the media coverage surrounding the Paradise Valley phantom. In an entry dated November 22, 1999, 6 days after Angela disappeared, Pendleton wrote a detailed critique of Detective Marcus Vance's investigative strategy, mocking the department for focusing their search teams on the desert highways while ignoring the immediate commercial construction sectors. The reading of these passages caused an immediate, powerful wave of revulsion to ripple through the packed gallery. Angela's surviving sister bowed her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking with a profound, generational grief as she was forced to listen to the calculated arrogance of the monster who had sat in her sister's kitchen, drank from her cups, and then watched her family collapse in slow motion from the comfort of his truck. The defense team's cross-examination of the FBI behavioral analyst was a brief, sweating exercise in legal futility. They attempted to suggest that the notebooks were merely the creative, fictional writing exercises of an eccentric man or the raw notes for an unwritten crime novel, a narrative so thin and transparent that it was met with audible scoffs from the spectators in the room. The analyst dismantled the theory with a single, devastating observation that left the defense counsel completely marooned. Fictional writers do not cross-reference their characters with real, active vehicle registration lookups obtained through commercial tracking systems. They do not preserve the actual laminated driver's licenses, silver charm bracelets, and skeletal remains of those characters beneath aggregate concrete foundations. These logs are a hunter's journal, kept to preserve the memory of his dominance over his targets. The prosecution followed this psychological deconstruction by calling a team of forensic computer analysts who had examined the personal digital devices and encrypted storage arrays seized from Pendleton's home office. The data retrieval specialists revealed that even in retirement, Pendleton had remained intensely obsessed with the progress of forensic technology, using private networks and secure databases to monitor the evolution of the Maricopa County Cold Case Unit. The analysts demonstrated that in the months leading up to his arrest in 2026, Pendleton had executed hundreds of digital searches regarding advancements in automated fingerprint identification system updates, the stability of latent prints on ceramic glazes over multi-decade intervals, and the legal admissibility of next-generation biometric comparisons. He had been tracking the progress of his own exposure, watching the scientific horizon slowly close the exits on his 27-year secret with the cold, paralyzed awareness of a cornered animal. The DONDAP presentation of digital searches, handwritten surveillance logs, and corporate billing statements left the defense table in a state of absolute, visible ruin. The high-priced defense attorneys sat with their heads lowered over their legal pads, their objections growing weaker and less frequent as the afternoon ground on, their strategy reduced to an existential wait for the prosecution to exhaust its list of exhibits. Pendleton himself remained an island of terrifying, frozen serenity, his head tilted slightly upward, his jaw set in a hard line that had been honed by decades of living behind a mask of total normalcy. He showed no fear, no anger, and no remorse. He merely observed the systematic dismantling of his life's work with the clinical curiosity of a general reviewing a failed campaign. He was a master manipulator who had finally been completely outmatched by the relentless, DONDAP march of modern forensic intelligence. Outside the courthouse walls, the city of Phoenix was living through a period of deep, system-wide vertigo that reached into every level of the civic identity. The realization that a prominent commercial contractor had used the very infrastructure of the city's rapid suburban expansion to shield a career of serial predation had broken something fundamental in the social contract between the citizens and the state. Local television networks ran continuous panel discussions featuring civil rights advocates, urban planning scholars, and retired homicide investigators, all demanding an immediate, independent restructuring of the municipal contract vetting process, and the creation of a permanent forensic review board with the power to audit historical infrastructure projects from the 1990s. The public trust was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, watchful vigilance that viewed every manicured green space, every retaining wall, and every master plan community through the dark, unforgiving prism of Arthur Pendleton's deception. As the fifth week of the trial drew to its close, the prosecution pulled the disparate elements of the psychological and behavioral evidence together into a singular, devastating climax. They recalled the lead cold case investigator to the witness stand, who presented a final, comprehensive spatial matrix that overlaid the dates of the disappearances listed within the hidden utility box against the active excavation permits Pendleton's landscaping company had held across the Southwest over a 20-year period. The graphic on the central monitor showed an unassailable, historic truth. Every time Pendleton's company was awarded a major grading contract for a new residential development, a target file appeared in a safe, and a young woman vanished from that exact sector within a 90-day window. He had grown alongside the city, using the concrete growth of the desert sprawl as a protective vault that insulated him from suspicion while he harvested lives across the region. The courtroom fell into a deep, heavy silence as Judge Sterling announced the weekend recess. The digital monitors faded to black, leaving the portraits of the 4 known victims lingering in the minds of the jurors like a permanent, unresolvable accusation that no legal rhetoric could ever hope to blur or erase. The prosecution had completed its behavioral and digital onslaught, leaving the defense with absolutely no ground to construct a counter-narrative or manufacture reasonable doubt in the final phases of the case. The long, agonizing night that had begun with an unlocked front door and a boiling teapot in Paradise Valley in November of 1999 was finally entering its terminal hours, and the city waited with a fierce, unified patience for the definitive delivery of an unappealable justice that was now close enough to touch in the coming days. The 10th movement of this long, haunting symphony of justice began with the quiet, deliberate assembly of the jury for the final stages of the trial, a process that felt less like a courtroom procedure and more like the culmination of a 24-year collective trauma. As the jurors filed into their boxes, their expressions were a study in heavy, weary resolve. They had spent weeks submerged in the dark, cold reality of the evidence, the meticulous diagrams of industrial neglect, the blood-stained ledgers of the city's urban development office, and the fragile, devastating pages of Martha Vance's diary. The courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. The gallery, packed with families who had lived the longest winters of their lives in the shadow of the unknown, sat with a collective, jagged tension. Arthur Vance, now shorn of the professional veneer he had spent his entire life crafting, sat motionless at the defense table, a hollowed-out figure of absolute, sociopathic detachment. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterwork of forensic synthesis, a narrative that moved with the precision of a clock. The district attorney did not lean into the melodramatic or the histrionic. She spoke with a clinical, terrifying clarity. She traced the arc of Arthur Vance's life, not as a series of random impulses, but as a deliberate, architectural project of cruelty. She projected the city maps onto the screens, highlighting how he had used his position within the municipal government to curate the darkness. She showed the jury the direct, mathematically significant correlation between his career milestones and the disappearances of the 12 women. It was not a theory, it was a blueprint. The jury watched in stunned, paralyzed silence as she laid out the diary entries alongside the city's official maintenance logs, proving, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the man who had been responsible for the city's safety had been the primary agent of its most intimate, brutal destruction. When the defense stood to make their final plea, the lack of conviction was palpable. They were trying to build a fortress out of smoke. They spoke of the lack of a smoking gun in the traditional sense, the lack of eyewitnesses, and the subjective nature of diary entries, arguments that dissolved the moment they were uttered. The jurors didn't look at the defense attorneys, they looked at the evidence. They looked at the concrete, the soil samples, the recovered charms and jewelry that had been meticulously tagged and displayed. The defense's attempt to paint Arthur Vance as a man of diminished capacity felt like an insult to the intelligence of everyone in the room. He wasn't diminished, he was calculated. He wasn't lost, he was exactly where he had intended to be, executing a plan that spanned nearly a quarter of a century. The final words of the defense, a plea for mercy based on the complexity of the human condition, were met with a cold, absolute silence that was the most powerful rejection of their argument possible. The deliberation phase, which many legal analysts had predicted would take days, ended in under 6 hours. When the foreperson of the jury stood, the courtroom seemed to contract. The sound of the paper being handed to the bailiff was the loudest thing in the world. As the verdict was read, count after count of capital murder, conspiracy, and administrative corruption, the room did not erupt into shouts. It erupted into the sound of a city finally exhaling. Mothers who had waited since 2002 to know the fate of their daughters bowed their heads, their shoulders finally dropping as the suffocating weight of the unknown was replaced by the cold, hard certainty of justice. Arthur Vance did not look up. He did not show anger. He did not show fear. He merely sat, a vessel of dead space, while the life he had built on the wreckage of others was officially, legally dismantled. The sentencing hearing, which occurred 2 days later, transformed the courtroom into a space of profound, collective healing. The victim impact statements were not merely legal requirements. They were the final testimonies of lives that had been lived, loved, and stolen. One by one, the families took the stand, their voices gaining in strength as they spoke of their lost ones, the violinists, the students, the future architects, the artists, whose potential had been erased in the cold, industrial dark. They addressed Arthur Vance directly, their eyes locked on his bowed head, ensuring that he heard every name, every story, and every broken heart. It was a reclaiming of the narrative. They were no longer victims of his secret. They were the architects of his public ruin. When the judge finally pronounced the sentence, 12 consecutive terms of life without the possibility of parole, she framed it not as a punishment, but as a permanent, absolute separation of a predator from the society he had tried to dismantle. As the bailiffs led Arthur Vance away for the final time, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from one of catharsis to one of quiet, disciplined resolve. The press, which had swarmed the building for months, found themselves at a loss for words, their usual rhetoric failing to capture the magnitude of what had just occurred. The city of Detroit, watching through live feeds and radio updates, experienced a profound, collective shift. The trial had been the final, necessary excavation of the truth, the procedural purging of a cancer that had been allowed to spread because people were too afraid, or too complicit, to look closely at the shadows. The diary, now safely housed in the evidence room, would soon be transferred to the historical archives, a document that had served its purpose as the primary instrument of justice. In the hours that followed the sentencing, the city began the process of decommissioning the trial infrastructure. The temporary court facility, the extra security, the media cordons, all were stripped away, leaving the city to return to a normalcy that felt, for the first time in 24 years, truly real. The Sterling family, now the focus of a global outpouring of solidarity, held a final, private gathering at the park where the brick home had once stood. They sat in the late summer grass, the air warm and smelling of the turning leaves, and finally allowed themselves to exist in a present that was not defined by the search for the missing. It was a moment of profound, human stillness, a testament to the fact that while the legal system had delivered the verdict, it was the persistent, unyielding love of the survivors that had truly solved the case. The forensic investigators, whose work had spanned nearly 3 years of constant, agonizing inquiry, began to process the end of their mission. They met in a quiet, nondescript downtown office, the file boxes stacked high around them, and for the first time, the subject was not the crime. They spoke of the future, of the reforms to the city planning department, of the new lighting codes, of the ways the Vance mandate would protect the city's youth in the coming decades. They were the silent, professional heroes of the saga, individuals who had stared into the heart of the darkness and had systematically, piece by piece, dismantled it. They recognized, with a sober clarity, that their success was not just a victory for the law, but a triumph of the truth over the convenient, industrial-scale lie that Arthur Vance had engineered. As night fell over the city of Detroit, the industrial sectors that had once been the focus of the forensic radar were now quiet, vibrant, and alive with the bustle of community life. The lights that had been installed in the aftermath of the discovery were burning bright, a constant, glowing deterrent to the kinds of isolation that Vance had once weaponized. The city was finally, irrevocably connected, its streets and alleys no longer the domain of the predator, but the shared, public space of the citizens. The long, industrial winter had reached its conclusion, and the city was moving forward, with a steady, determined pace, into a future that was defined by the light of the truth, rather than the shadows of the past. The case of the Detroit Phantom was concluded, a long, complex, and devastating chapter that had been fully, finally, and irrevocably closed, leaving in its wake a city that was forever changed, forever marked, and, most importantly, forever watchful. The final, silent witness to the entire saga was the very terrain that had held the secrets of the dead for so long. The abandoned factories, the drainage culverts, and the desolate rail yards were no longer the silent, complicit backdrops to a hidden history. They were being repurposed, their structures integrated into the new, transparent urban plan of the city. Nature had been the first to discover the truth, and the forensic process had been the mechanism by which that truth was elevated to the status of legal fact. The cycle of the cold case, which had begun with an act of profound, calculated violation, had concluded with the restoration of order, the identification of the victims, and the final, absolute accounting of the perpetrator. It was a narrative of profound tragedy, yet one that concluded with the rare, necessary, and absolute satisfaction of a long overdue, final, and total justice. The long, agonizing night had ended, and the city of Detroit, once darkened by the shadow of the Phantom, was finally, peacefully, home again. As the decade drew to a close, the final report was archived. The boxes were shelved, the databases were locked, and the memory of the winter of 2002 became a permanent, foundational part of the city's modern lore. The trial of Arthur Vance remained the most significant event in the city's history, not for the horror it revealed, but for the clarity it demanded. It was the moment the city looked at its own reflection, saw the monster hidden in its midst, and decided, in a collective act of will, that it would never again allow the shadows to take hold. The long, industrial winter was over, the ice had thawed, and the truth, in all its devastating, human, and final glory, was the only thing left standing in the light of the morning. Justice, in its cold, precise, and necessary form, had finally been served, and the Phantom had been left in the dark, forever, while the city moved on, into the light. The technical and behavioral framework established over the preceding 5 weeks inside the Maricopa County Courthouse had systematically closed every conventional avenue of escape for Arthur Pendleton, but as the trial surged into its 7th major movement, the state prepared to lay bare the absolute, chemical reality of the physical mechanics used to execute the extraction of Angela Sterling. The district attorney launched a DONDAP, unrelenting sequence of specialized forensic testimonies, calling microtrace analysts, industrial toxicologists, and structural engineers to the witness stand. The narrative shifted from macroscopic maps and corporate timelines down to the subatomic and chemical markers left behind in the immediate interior of Angela's Paradise Valley apartment on November 16, 1999. The objective was absolute: to prove that the defendant did not merely cross paths with a victim by happenstance, but that he had utilized a highly specific, industrial-grade chemical signature to immobilize her within her own sanctuary before any cry for help could puncture the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. The focus of the week's opening testimony centered on the exhaustive microanalysis of the white ceramic coffee cup that had stood as a silent sentinel on the glass kitchen table for 27 years. The prosecution called a senior trace materials expert from the Arizona Department of Public Safety, who had spent months analyzing the residual fluid film scraped from the inner glaze of the cup using gas chromatography mass spectrometry. The analyst projected massive, multicolored chemical spectrum charts onto the courtroom screens, revealing a sharp, anomalous spike that completely defied the compound signature of ordinary dark roast coffee. When we isolated the chemical fractions within the cup sediment, the analyst testified, his voice carrying a flat, metallic resonance that commanded the room, we discovered distinct, highly concentrated residues of an industrial-grade veterinary anesthetic compound that was manufactured exclusively for the sedation of large livestock during the late 90s. The chemical analyst demonstrated that this specific compound was entirely colorless, virtually tasteless, when masked by a strong, dark roast coffee blend, and capable of inducing deep, near-instantaneous physical paralysis and unconsciousness within 90 seconds of ingestion. The prosecution synchronized this chemical data with the historical inventory records of Pendleton's landscaping enterprise from the autumn of 1999, which had been retrieved from state commercial agricultural compliance archives under federal subpoena. A red indicator line flared onto the monitors, highlighting a series of bulk chemical purchases Pendleton had signed for at a regional veterinary supply warehouse in Scottsdale, claiming the anesthetic was intended for feral animal control along the peripheral perimeters of his commercial maintenance contracts. The presentation was quick, donned-up, and highly visual, leaving the defense table in a state of absolute, visible shock as the image of Pendleton's bold ink signature on the chemical logs burned into the minds of the jurors. The spatial context of the crime scene was further deconstructed when the prosecution called the master line technician who had performed the microscopic fiber analysis on the beige carpet samples recovered from Angela's front entryway in 1999. The technician used a three-dimensional digital model to explain how the modern forensic light source array had identified ultrafine, highly resilient synthetic polymers embedded deep within the weave of the carpet, directly beneath the threshold of the unlocked rear kitchen door. These polymers were not typical residential carpet fibers. They were unique, industrial-grade nylon weave used exclusively in the production of professional heavy-duty commercial grass catcher bags attached to the industrial mowers Pendleton's crews deployed daily across the Paradise Valley sector. The technician proved that the distribution pattern of these fibers was concentrated in a linear path across the kitchen tile, indicating that a heavy, high-friction object lined with that exact material had been dragged across the floor during the critical 4-hour window when Angela's phone records went completely dead. As the fiber expert detailed the friction mapping, the jury watched the visual grid arrays on the monitors illuminate the path of the extraction. The defense table remained a zone of rigid, sweating immobility. Pendleton sat with his weathered hands clenched into tight fists against his lap, his face an unmoving mask of cracked leather, but his jaw muscle-pulsed with a frantic intensity that betrayed his deep internal panic. He was seeing the digital resurrection of an entry path he believed he had completely insulated from detection by utilizing his everyday commercial equipment as the physical container to move his victim past the open windows of the neighboring apartments. The prosecution was effectively demonstrating that his commercial landscaping tools were not just items of trade. They were the tactical instruments of a calculated abduction, designed to move a body through a high-visibility residential sector without triggering a single alarm or drawing an inquisitive glance from the security staff. The legal battle over the validity of this chemical and material trace analysis reached a high-stakes climax when the defense team launched a frantic, sweeping motion to have the entire mass spectrometry dataset excluded from the trial record. They argued that because the liquid residue inside the ceramic coffee cup had been stored in a standard analog evidence locker for nearly 3 decades, the potential for ambient environmental degradation and chemical migration made the current testing inherently unreliable for a capital case. The defense counsel delivered the argument with a sweating, hyper-focused intensity, realizing that if the livestock anesthetic markers remained admissible, their client's baseline defense of an accidental social visit was completely vaporized. The district attorney's response was an immediate, devastating display of judicial mastery that cut through the defense's rhetoric like a scalpel. She stood before the bench, her voice ringing with a clear, metallic force that echoed off the high plaster ceilings of the courtroom. "This is not corrupted data," she stated flatly, her eyes locking onto the judge. The ceramic glaze of that cup functioned as a non-porous chemical capsule, locking the anesthetic compound into a stable crystalline matrix that primitive 1999 laboratories could never extract, but which modern mass spectrometry reads with absolute mathematical precision. The defendant relies on the slow passage of time to dissolve his tracks, but the chemistry of his crime does not degrade. The footprint of his poison remains as clear today as it was on the morning he left that cup on Angela Sterling's table. Judge Sterling denied the motion to suppress, without a moment's hesitation, her gavel striking the wooden block with a definitive, ringing finality that signaled the absolute collapse of the defense's procedural shield. With the legal barriers shattered, the prosecution moved into the final, most harrowing phase of its material evidence presentation, calling the lead automotive forensic specialist who had disassembled Pendleton's original 1999 commercial white utility van, which had been recovered from a state salvage yard in early 2026. The witness walked the jury through a sequence of high-resolution photographs that documented the microscopic excavation of the van's rear storage compartment. The images showed a space that had been heavily modified with secondary sheet metal plating and sealed with industrial rubberized weather stripping, modifications that Pendleton had officially logged in his corporate maintenance records as an upgrade to prevent chemical spills from leaking into the vehicle's chassis. But beneath the rusted iron plates, the automotive forensic team had utilized an ultrasensitive mass spectrometer to scan the deep seams of the floorboards. The projection screens flared with high-resolution digital scans revealing distinct, localized traces of the exact same livestock anesthetic compound found inside the ceramic coffee cup, along with microscopic drops of degraded biological material that had leached through the seams of the metal before the concrete cap could be poured at the desert site. The expert demonstrated through a three-dimensional geographic simulation that the chemical residue on the floorboards was concentrated in a shape that matched the dimensions of the heavy nylon grass catcher bag, providing an unshakable, physical link between the kitchen table of Paradise Valley, the transport vehicle, and the ultimate concrete tomb in the northern desert canyons. The science was absolute. It stripped the defense of any remaining room to manufacture alternative alibis or argue sample contamination, proving with the absolute certainty of physics that the quiet contractor's vehicle had functioned as a mobile processing unit for his violence. The DONDAP presentation of mass spectrometry profiles, synthetic polymer matches, and automotive modifications left the defense table in a state of complete, unmitigated ruin. They sat in low, frantic huddles, their legal pads covered in crossed-out notes and abandoned strategies, their expressions reflecting the absolute certainty of an impending defeat, while Pendleton himself seemed to withdraw deeper into a state of frozen, unblinking isolation. The trial was entering its terminal phases. The complex layers of the 30-year camouflage had been stripped away drop by drop, and the city of Phoenix watched with a fierce, unwavering focus as the long, agonizing night that had begun in Cascade Heights and Paradise Valley in November of 1999 marched relentlessly toward its final, unappealable hour of absolute justice. The technical and chemical net cast by the prosecution had systematically enclosed Arthur Pendleton, but as the trial inside the Maricopa County Courthouse entered its eighth comprehensive phase, the narrative expanded to expose the calculated structural shield he had built within the civic and financial landscape of Arizona. The district attorney launched a DONDAP, rapid progression of testimony from forensic accountants, municipal regulatory auditors, and historical real estate investigators. The objective was absolute: to prove that Pendleton's 27-year survival was not a matter of luck or passive evasion, but the result of a deliberate, institutional exploitation of the Southwest's rapid urban expansion. He had used his corporate infrastructure, his cash reserves, and the bureaucratic chaos of a booming city to actively hide his crimes, turning the very growth of Phoenix into a protective shell that insulated him from the radar of the cold case unit. The week opened with a testimony of a senior financial investigator from the Arizona Department of Revenue, who had spent months unraveling the complex banking history of Pendleton's landscaping enterprise dating back to the late 1980s. The analyst projected massive, synchronized financial ledgers onto the courtroom screens, detailing a series of highly structured, non-indexed transactions that occurred in the immediate aftermath of Angela Sterling's disappearance. The presentation was quick, donned-up, and highly visual, showing the jury how Pendleton had systematically moved large tranches of capital through a network of local credit unions and private equipment leasing companies. The investigator pointed directly to a major cash withdrawal executed on November 17, 1999, less than 24 hours after Angela vanished from Paradise Valley. When we track the liquid assets of the corporation during this 48-hour window, the investigator testified, his voice cutting through the clinical chill of the room, we detect an immediate, unexplained liquidation of $5,000 in cash, processed entirely through manual teller counters to avoid federal reporting triggers. The prosecution synchronized this cash trail with the construction manifests for the Northern Sonoran Desert Reserve property where Angela's remains were ultimately recovered. A red timeline indicator flared to life on the monitors, proving that on the exact afternoon Pendleton was withdrawing these unmapped funds, his company had paid a private, independent cement mixer owner a cash premium to deliver an off-schedule batch of volcanic ash aggregate concrete directly to the remote desert canyon site. The defense team launched a frantic objection, claiming that cash transactions were a standard, routine practice for small contracting firms handling rural equipment emergencies in the pre-digital era. But Judge Sterling denied the motion with an icy brevity. The data was anchored by the independent mixer's archived personal receipt books, which the cold case unit had unearthed from a storage locker in Mesa, proving an absolute, calculated pattern of off-the-books logistics engineered to ensure that no corporate invoice would ever connect Pendleton's commercial accounts to the construction of the desert tomb. The administrative deconstruction descended into an even more chilling phase when the prosecution called a veteran real estate title auditor who had analyzed the historical zoning and land use permits Pendleton's firm had acquired during the late 1990s. The auditor demonstrated through a three-dimensional geographical mapping sequence that Pendleton had intentionally bid on municipal clearing contracts for areas that were officially designated as permanent environmental preservation zones or future public utility corridors. These specific designations guaranteed that the land would never be subjected to deep residential excavation or commercial foundation work for at least 50 years under Arizona state law. The defendant did not choose his burial sites at random, the auditor stated, her voice sharp and metallic as she addressed the jury box. He explicitly selected sectors where the regulatory framework of the city guaranteed that the ground would remain undisturbed for generations. He turned the municipal master plan into his personal, legal camouflage. As the title auditor detailed the long-term zoning projections, the jury sat in a state of uniform, frozen hostility. The defense table remained a zone of rigid, sweating immobility. Pendleton sat with his weathered chin resting near his chest, his eyes tracking the moving data arrays on the monitors with a sharp, calculating focus that revealed his internal panic. He was seeing the digital exposure of a strategy he believed was completely infallible, a strategy born from his intimate, professional knowledge of how city governments archive, process, and forget land use data over multi-decade intervals. The prosecution was proving that every square yard of concrete his company had poured along the peripheral canyons was an act of deliberate forensic engineering, designed to use the physical weight of the city's expanding infrastructure to crush any potential for future discovery. The legal battle over the admissibility of these historical financial and land use records reached a high-stakes climax when the defense team launched a desperate, sweeping motion to have the entire corporate asset history excluded from the trial, arguing that the state was conducting a highly prejudicial character assassination by framing standard commercial operations as a criminal conspiracy. They claimed that tracing decades of routine business expenses and zoning permits was an unproven, circumstantial methodology that had no direct logical bearing on the singular count of capital murder listed in the indictment. The defense counsel delivered the argument with a sweating, frantic intensity, realizing that if the financial and land ledgers remained in the record, their client's image as a simple, uneducated lawn contractor was permanently dead. The district attorney's response was a swift, clinical exercise in judicial logic that cut through the defense's rhetoric like a scalpel. She stood before the bench, her voice carrying a hard, metallic resonance that echoed off the high plaster ceilings of the courtroom. "This is not standard commercial operation," she stated flatly, her eyes locking onto the judge with an uncompromising focus. "This is the financial and administrative infrastructure of an apex predator. A routine contractor does not pay cash premiums in the dead of night to secure non-standard concrete aggregate for an unauthorized retaining wall inside a protected nature reserve. The defendant used his business as a shield, his accounting as an eraser, and his knowledge of the zoning laws as a vault. To exclude these records would be to allow the complexity of his camouflage to protect him from the consequences of his violence." Judge Sterling denied the defense's motion to exclude without a moment's hesitation, her gavel striking the wooden block with a definitive finality that signaled the total collapse of the defendant's procedural armor. With the legal barriers shattered, the prosecution moved into the final, most harrowing phase of its structural evidence presentation, calling the retired municipal archivist who had overseen the physical storage of the Valley's historical zoning maps during the city's transition to digital recording systems in the early 2000s. The witness testified that in the summer of 2004, exactly 5 years after Angela's murder, when the regional focus on the cold case had begun to completely evaporate, Arthur Pendleton had volunteered to serve on a citizen-led civic advisory committee tasked with reviewing the digitization of historical property records for the northern Maricopa sectors. He had used his committee credentials to gain unrestricted, unmonitored access to the physical blueprint vaults, where he spent dozens of hours reviewing the ancient, hand-drawn survey maps of the Sonoran Reserve corridors. The projection screens flared with digital log signatures from the archive's automated entry systems, showing that Pendleton had repeatedly accessed the specific topographic folder containing the retaining wall blueprints from November 1999. The analyst proved that 2 critical pages detailing the subsurface bedrock drillings for that exact foundation line had been physically removed from the folder during the period of Pendleton's tenure on the committee. He had believed that by destroying the physical blueprint records of the subsurface modifications, he had permanently eliminated any trail that would lead a future municipal engineering crew to suspect the presence of an unmapped concrete cap beneath the clay. But he had failed to realize that the State Highway Department had maintained an independent, microfilmed duplicate of the engineering specs in an underground archive in Tucson, a duplicate that the cold case unit retrieved and verified with submicron clarity in 2026. The DONDAP presentation of financial liquidations, zoning manipulations, and deleted blueprints left the defense table in a state of absolute, visible ruin. The high-priced defense counsel sat with their heads lowered over their desks, their legal pads covered in crossed-out arguments, their posture reflecting the crushing weight of a legal trap that had closed completely. They had no witnesses to call, no alternative data to present, and no narrative framework that could explain how their client's name, money, and corporate access had been systematically used to alter the official memory of the city. Pendleton himself remained an island of terrifying, frozen composure, his face an unmoving mask of stone as he watched the electronic data streams map out his lifelong campaign of deception. He had outlived his own cleverness, an elite contractor who had been completely outmatched by the relentless, DONDAP march of modern data forensics and structural transparency. Outside the courthouse walls, the city of Phoenix was living through a period of deep, system-wide vertigo that reached into every level of the civic identity. The realization that a prominent commercial operator had spent decades actively manipulating the municipal records system to shield a career of serial murder had broken something fundamental in the social contract between the citizens and the state. Local news networks ran continuous panel discussions featuring civil rights advocates, urban planning scholars, and retired homicide investigators, all demanding an immediate, independent restructuring of the municipal contract vetting process, and the creation of a permanent forensic review board with the power to audit historical public works projects from the late 90s. The public trust was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, watchful vigilance that viewed every manicured green space, every retaining wall, and every master plan community through the dark, unforgiving prism of Arthur Pendleton's 27-year deception. As the 8th week of the trial drew to its close, the prosecution pulled the disparate elements of the financial and administrative evidence together into a singular, devastating climax. They recalled the lead cold case investigator to the witness stand, who presented a final, comprehensive matrix that overlaid the dates of the structural blueprint deletions against the active real estate investments Pendleton's landscaping company had executed across the Southwest over a 20-year period. The graphic on the central monitor showed an unassailable, historic truth. Every time a technological upgrade threatened to expose his historical projects, Pendleton had deployed his corporate capital and his civic credentials to alter the records, proving that his long career of survival was not a matter of luck, but a continuous, active campaign of structural counterintelligence executed from the very heart of the commercial establishment. The courtroom fell into a deep, heavy silence as Judge Sterling announced the weekend recess. The digital monitors faded to black, leaving the portraits of the victims lingering in the minds of the jurors like a permanent, unresolvable accusation that no legal rhetoric could ever hope to blur or erase. The prosecution had completed its administrative and structural onslaught, leaving the defense with absolutely no ground to construct a counter-narrative or manufacture reasonable doubt in the final phases of a case. The long, agonizing night that had begun with an unlocked front door and a boiling teapot in Paradise Valley in November of 1999 was finally entering its terminal hours, and the city waited with a fierce, unified patience for the definitive delivery of an unappealable justice that was now close enough to touch in the coming days. The transition into the 9th week of the trial inside the Maricopa County Courthouse brought the sprawling, high-tech forensic narrative to a point of intense, concentrated psychological pressure. The state's prosecution team had systematically laid bare the biological reality of the next-generation fingerprint match, the physical geography of the desert concrete tomb, and the calculated corporate financial network that Arthur Pendleton had used to mask his movements. Now, the district attorney moved to execute the final, clinical phase of her primary strategy, the total deconstruction of the defendant's psychological camouflage. The 40-year performance of a quiet, mundane suburban contractor that had insulated him from suspicion while he systematically harvested lives along the expanding periphery of the American Southwest. The state launched a DONDAP, rapid progression of expert testimony, calling forensic psychiatrists, behavioral analysts from the Federal Intelligence Matrix, and digital data retrieval specialists to the witness stand. The focal point of the week's opening testimony was the exhaustive analysis of the digital footprint Pendleton had left behind on private networks and encrypted data servers during his final years of retirement leading up to the 2026 raid. The prosecution called a senior cyber forensics engineer from the Arizona Department of Public Safety, who had spent months extracting non-indexed data from Pendleton's personal home devices. The engineer demonstrated to the jury that between 2018 and 2026, Pendleton had used advanced virtual private networks and secure Tor gateways to monitor the technological updates implemented by the Maricopa County Cold Case Unit. The presentation was quick, DONDAP, and highly visual, projecting a series of encrypted search queries directly onto the massive courtroom monitors. The data proved that every time a regional news outlet published an article detailing advancements in automated fingerprint identification systems or the successful extraction of degraded latent prints from ceramic glazes, Pendleton's user profile would log into secure legal and scientific databases, purchasing white papers on the exact mechanics of forensic molecular stability. As the cyber engineer walked the jury through these automated access logs, the red indicators on the display screen showed a pattern of intense, localized digital activity that perfectly matched the timeline of modern forensic evolution. The jury watched with a hard, unblinking focus as the prosecution demonstrated that Pendleton's calm, indifferent demeanor in court was a total fabrication. Privately, he had been living in a state of continuous, high-tech internal panic for nearly a decade, watching the scientific horizon slowly close the exits on his 27-year-old secret. He had not been resting peacefully in his suburban estate. He had been actively monitoring the advance of the future, analyzing the threat potential of every new laboratory method, and utilizing his extensive personal computer arrays to evaluate whether the microscopic friction ridges he had left on the handle of Angela Sterling's coffee cup in November of 1999 could ever be translated into an arrest warrant. The mechanical calculation of his survival strategy became even more terrifying when the state called a veteran forensic psychiatrist who had spent weeks evaluating the extensive surveillance logs and handwritten journals seized from Pendleton's workshop safe. The witness walked the jury through the complex clinical paradigm of predatory compartmentalization, explaining how Pendleton was capable of transitioning seamlessly from the high-friction violence of his nocturnal excursions to the disciplined, customer-oriented environment of a commercial landscaping business owner. The defendant did not suffer from a classic psychological fracture or a loss of cognitive control. The psychiatrist testified, his voice maintaining a flat, clinical neutrality that sliced through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. He viewed his criminal activities as a proprietary extension of his professional routine. To him, the expanding city of Phoenix was a geometric grid where his landscaping contracts granted him the ultimate form of physical camouflage. He preserved his trophies because they were the material proof of his capacity to alter the landscape without the system ever detecting his hand. The prosecution followed this behavioral analysis by introducing digital scans of Pendleton's personal journals from the months immediately following the 1999 abduction. These entries were not emotional expressions of remorse or chaotic descriptions of fear. They were cold, clinical evaluations of the Phoenix Police Department's tactical response and the media's coverage of the Paradise Valley Phantom. In an entry dated December 4, 1999, less than 3 weeks after Angela vanished, Pendleton had written a detailed, multi-point critique of Detective Marcus Vance's search perimeter, noting that the police were wasting critical resources tracking desert highways while completely failing to audit the off-schedule concrete deliveries inside the active residential construction zones. The reading of this passage caused an immediate, powerful wave of revulsion to ripple through the crowded gallery. Angela's surviving sister bowed her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking with a profound, generational grief as the cold, calculating voice of her sister's assassin filled the sterile space of the courtroom. The legal defense team's response to this behavioral and